Okay, so welcome to Friday. It says Tuesday. I forgot to change that throughout the week, and no one told me, I guess. It's day 5. It's Friday. So this is the list of people I had signed up for the Friday tour of Mesa Lab, of the exhibits and stuff. If you are interested in joining that tour, you probably can just show up too if you missed your tour earlier in the week. They don't take attendance or anything like that. So it was more so that we could try to make sure they had a reasonable tour size every day. And the other thing I want to point out, this is a picture from Elizabeth yesterday. If you have not yet seen any deer, there are often deer that kind of hang out across the tree plaza down in the shady area right next to the building. So if you haven't seen them yet, you can go try to find them. All right. The next thing, we just have a few logistics announcements from Elizabeth here.
Yeah, good morning. And then I was standing outside yesterday afternoon and I saw that guy like race up the trail too. So I don't know, maybe those of you that went on the hike might have seen him too. So good morning. Did some of you go on the hike? Oh, you did? Okay.
Woo.
Because I thought, oh, maybe they didn't make it back. Right. Yes, right. That was my thought. Good. So my announcement this morning applies to those of you that we have supported for your travel here. So local folks, I'm sorry, you can zone out for 2 minutes. You have to check out tomorrow. You can do that right at the desk in the dorm. You can purchase breakfast tomorrow if you'd like. The lodging is like per night, so it was too complicated, got too expensive to cover breakfast again tomorrow. So just so that you know, if you go to breakfast before you check out and your badge doesn't work, that's why. Please save your receipts. You'll get a message from myself, Teresa, Daniel, Kaylin, or Kayla next week when we work on your expense reports. So we do encourage you to take the RTD because it's free. So if you allow for enough time, the RTD is about an hour from here in Boulder to get to Denver. Denver security can be a bit of a nightmare, so don't cut it too close. I also know there's about 10 big events going on in Denver, including Taylor Swift, the Rockies and the Yankees, Cirque du Soleil, a veterinary conference, the National Pickleball Championship, some car racing at a pretty famous racetrack, and it's their final season, so that's a big deal. So these are just the things that I've accumulated just by like a distance this week while being here. So allow enough time, please, for your travel. And then finally, if you're flying at a really strange time and the bus really doesn't work and you need to schedule a shuttle or an Uber, please do save those receipts as well, because if you tell us that you've used those services and you don't have a receipt, we can really only reimburse up to $50. And I know for sure it's more than $50 to get from Boulder to the Denver airport. And then the last thing too is then in terms of per diem on your travel days, you'll get partial per diem on those travel days. So does anybody have any questions? I know that was a lot, and we will spell this all out in our email. I just wanted to give you a heads up before I let you go.
Is that for certain people, or like that came from outside, or everyone who came from out of the Denver
Everyone
area?
who we connected with and is staying on campus.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah. Because we covered your breakfast and your dinner, so you won't get per diem on those days. That would be a conflict of interest. Any other questions? And I'll be here, and Teresa will be here. We'll be at the front desk all day. So if you have other questions, please feel free to reach out. Thank you.
And thank you so much to Elizabeth for working on all those logistics. Please.
Thank you.
All right. So today, this is some of the fallout from yesterday's lab session. I'm guessing a lot of you aren't on this newsletter, but we got an email close to 5 that was like, oh, Jupiter is having some issues. It's being investigated. We don't know when it'll be up. So I know they've been working on it. I think they're hoping to get it up today so that we might be able to use it in tandem with the challenge exercises. I think the key is that we just don't all sign on in the same 2 or 3 minute window. So we'll talk to you more about that when we get to this afternoon's exercises. So, okay, it's the final day. How are you feeling? We know that the computer's feeling like this. That was me during some planning, at the end of some planning meeting in like February, in one of the rooms up here. So I also fell asleep at like 7:30 last night, so that was also me last night. So anyway, just do a check-in with yourself. You don't have to raise your hands who's feeling one way or the other, but you know, you might be feeling like, oh, I got it. I can graduate this and continue to use CESM. So there are a few things, I'm going to jump back and forth here, that I just want to make you aware of now that the tutorial's over. So like, now what? And the biggest thing that we continue to encourage you to do is get involved in the CESM community. So CESM is really a unique model in that it's community governed. And that means we have these working groups that help dictate the priorities for the model in general. And so I'm going to escape here. This website I have listed, I just opened it already here. So this is the CESM website, and if you go to this drop-down of working groups, let's say you're interested in the atmosphere, you can click on that. It'll tell you about things that are going on with the atmospheric model working group. And then there's this link, co-chairs and contacts, and this should be there for all the working groups. So if there's a science liaison, it's Cecile, in case you're wondering. You've seen Cecile this week. Sometimes there's a software-specific liaison too. And then there are co-chairs. And so if you wanted to talk to a particular person in the working group, this is your first step of point of contact. I'm going to go back to the main page. And I also want to point out that in this document, on this website that you've been using all week, one of the things I suggested when I sent out the prerequisites email was to read through this introduction. And if you go to project organization, it talks here about how the CESM project's organized, and it has links directly to the working groups. So a lot of this information is in the website we've been using all week, but I just wanted to point it out so you can kind of find it multiple ways. And these slides will be available, so you can also look at that. So when you get involved in the community, most of the working groups have mailing lists. Join those. You'll get emails about what's going on in the community in that particular working group. Like I said, there's a liaison and a co-chair, and those are people who you might contact. And then there are particular events that I think you might want to keep on your calendars. So there's winter working group meetings. These are working group specific. They happen on different weeks. So like the atmospheric model working group is on a different week than the land model working group. But these are really focused on the business of the working groups. There's usually an option to attend remotely for free if travel to get here is difficult. So I'd really encourage you to sign up for that, even if you sit as a fly in the wall for the first year. Maybe you'll learn about what's going on and kind of get more involved. You can also sign up to give a talk, and announcements for that are often sent through the mailing lists. There's also the annual CESM workshop that happens in June. This is all the working groups have meetings at once. It's often a lot more science focused. And again, you can give talks. This year, at least, there was a remote option. It was hybrid, so there were a lot of people in person. And we really hope that we see you at one of these workshops in the future. All right, now that the tutorial's over, how do I get help? So the first thing I want to say, this website that we've been using, this one right here, it will stay up there. We're going to try to make changes to all the bugs and typos you guys have found, so it'll change slightly, but it'll still be there. And again, under introduction, one of the little drop downs is getting help. So you can go here to getting help. It gives you links to the discussion forums. It talks about the events, so like I just said, working group meetings and stuff like that. And there are different email lists, and then it also talks about how you can get alerts from GitHub about when there are code changes. So go to that. You also, all the presentations will be available from this week. I showed you this yesterday, so if you're like, I need to port now, but I forgot what Jim Edwards said about this thing in that one file, you can go back, you can click on the presentations. Looks like Thursday. His porting is already up. You can click on that, and you have all those slides, and you can watch it in tandem with YouTube if you need to remember whatever it was that he said. There's also the bulletin boards. So here's the bulletin boards. There are a bunch of different topics. There are topics about each of the different components. So there are conversations about CAM or CAM-CHEM, all the different things. There's also one about porting. And this is really the fastest way you're going to get a response. So rather than maybe immediately emailing Cecile an atmosphere question, post something here. The liaisons do check this, and one of the reasons they prefer having things posted here is that the whole community can benefit from what the answer is. So maybe before posting, kind of search this to see if someone else has had that problem, because the answer is they probably have. And if they haven't, you found a new bug, congratulations, or maybe not bug, but you have a new challenge, and it will get answered there and benefit people in years to come. So, okay, so we have that practical activity website. We have the presentations from this week. All these links will be on that presentations from this week website. There are the bulletin boards, and we want you to join a working group. And those are all ways, like if you have a very CAM-specific question or a very CLM, CTSM-specific question, sometimes being part of the working group can help you get your questions answered or figure out whatever needs to happen for your research to go forward. All right, I also just included these links here. They'll be posted about how to get allocations on the supercomputer, because I've had a number of people ask me that. So I've opened a lot of these windows. Let's see. So this is what that page looks like. I just want to point out there are different types of allocations. So there's university allocations. And if you click that link, they talk about what these mean. There are large, small, exploratory, and classroom allocations. And so some of them you have to have an NSF award. Some you do not have to have an NSF award. And I would just suggest that you look through this to try to figure out what specifically you'd need and go through this process. Talking to me specifically or is not really the best way to do that, because I don't necessarily know the CESL process as well. And then I also want to point out for the allocations, again, get involved with a working group, because the more involved you are, there sometimes are resources available in those groups. And if you're an active participating member and you want to propose experiments, some of your experiments might be able to be at least partially funded, partially supported that way. But if you just randomly pop up every year and you're like, I want resources, they might not support that, because they're like, well, where have you been? How are you contributing to this group? So there's kind of a relationship there that they they want you to be active if you're going to get resources, but something to consider. All right, and then the last few things, I've had a couple of people ask me about postdocs and stuff like that. So all jobs at NCAR are posted at this website here. I didn't open it, but you'll have the link. So this is where postdocs are posted, project scientist positions are posted, all of that stuff is posted here. And then I do just want to point out that there is something called the NCAR Advanced Study Program. If you go to this website right here, it talks a lot more about it. But there are two types of programs that might apply to many of you, which is a graduate visitor program. You apply, and it is competitive. But if you get awarded this, you can come visit NCAR, and they'll support at least some of your visit. I think they'll support the housing and food and all that, but not your salary. And then the postdoctoral fellowship program, again, it's an application process. You propose what you would like to do for a postdoc, and then if awarded, you come here, and they just support your postdoc study. It's very flexible. It's also very competitive too, but I want you to be aware of this, because if you don't apply, you most certainly will not get it. All right, today's agenda. The first talks today will be about biogeochemistry, and we'll get to there in a minute, and land ice modeling. I wore my penguin socks today and my Antarctica shirt, but then really the question today was like, I have too much polar stuff, so I also have narwhal socks. So I do support the Arctic and other penguin socks, but they're tall and it's too hot to do that. So to represent, I also have my penguin stuffed animal and my polar bear stuffed animals. Really, I am such a nerd, and a walrus stuffed animal. So yeah, since I study the poles, I have lots of little polar things. So so land ice is polar. That's partly why I got those out then. After the land ice talk, there will be a break with food. Today it's donuts. Yay, the admins went above and beyond to get this today. Then to finish up the morning, we'll have some special lectures about variable resolution in the atmosphere, and then another talk about climate justice. And then we'll go into lunch. We'll leave from here again. So if you're going on the Mesa Lab tour, you'll just meet in the lobby at 12, but hopefully we'll be on time and you'll have enough time to eat lunch before you do that. And then in the afternoon, we'll have one more special lecture about Earth system prediction. And then we'll go into the challenge exercises, and we'll break out into rooms. We'll start in here, and I'll tell you whatever's happening with Jupiter or not. But then we'll break up into different rooms depending on the component of interest, and we really encourage you, even if you made friends this week, but you're interested in different components, go to the room where the components are interested, where there's the component of interest to you, because you're gonna learn the most by doing that exercise. And the experts for that model component will be in that room. We're not just running the fully coupled model. We're running other comp sets, stuff like that, and you'll learn the most that's relevant to you by doing that. Because I noticed yesterday the number of hands that I had people put up who were interested in like the ocean did not match the people in the Damon room. So I'm not going to police what room you go, but I just wanted to say we have experts for the different components here specifically. All right. And then there'll be a break in the middle of that. It's starting a little earlier today. And then we'll meet back in here at 3:45. And Gokhan, who's the current chief scientist, will give a lecture about the project, kind of future directions, stuff like that. And then at the very end of the day, we have a daily debrief, and we're going to send you a survey. Elizabeth will send the survey directly to your emails. But we built in time for you to answer it while you're here, because your feedback is actually really important to us. There's a number of things that we changed this year, like the online documentation, that we would really appreciate feedback for. And getting that feedback helps us continue to get funding to bring people here. So it is really important that you do this. It's a little on the long side. It will be open beyond just today, but we wanted to set aside time for you to do that specifically. And then the shuttle will leave here again at 5. If you have some different case, talk to me or Elizabeth and we'll help you. So are there any other questions before we start to learn about ocean biogeochemistry? Got one.
Thank you very much. My questions are mainly related to the access should we keep the access to the supercomputer, or after we get back to our home institutions? And also, are you going to add us directly to the mailing list so we can get notification or any updates or newsletter, something like that?
Yeah, we will not add you to the mailing list. You need to choose which mailing list you want to be added to. As for the accounts, so usually the accounts end today, but because of the issues yesterday, CISL is considering extending everyone's accounts for a week so that you could do the Jupyter exercises on your own time in the next week. I think there won't be reservations and stuff like that, but if we're not all hitting the system at once and you kind of do it distributed, it should be okay. But it's not an indefinite account. So if you want to continue working on Cheyenne, you have to go to that allocations page and ask for an extension of your account. All right, without further ado then, let's have Keith come up. So Keith is a mathematician. He works in the oceanography section here at NCAR. He has done a lot with ocean biogeochemistry, but also has looked through all parts of the model and finds lots of things that, are little bugs that it's like, oh, we have to fix that. So let's learn more about biogeochemical modeling.
Thank you, Alice. So you see ocean biogeochemical modeling, and maybe it's early on Friday morning and it's a long week, you're tired. Maybe you only care about the teleconnections between ENSO and the monsoon, or the impact of sudden stratospheric warmings on the nitrogen cycle, or the impact of hydrology on the phenology of larch trees. So maybe you're thinking you're going to get a good nap here. Well, first I'm going to do some audience participation to delay your nap. So you're all here to learn about CESM, a model. Model is a tool to answer questions that you are trying to research. So in order for the tool to be useful, then you need to know that the tool is applicable to the questions that you're studying. So how do you know if the tool is applicable to the questions that you are studying? And I just want to get some quick answers. I'm not going to pass around a mic. I'll repeat the answers through my microphone. So feel free to raise your hand and say, how do you know if the tool that you're trying to use is actually appropriate? Don't be shy, even though it's Friday morning. Yes?
Initially, you might not have any idea, but after asking questions, getting expertise and advice, you feel like, based on feedback, that it would be an appropriate.
Good answer. I'm getting expert advice. How about some others? Yes?
You need to validate with observational data first, so what the model.
That's a great answer. We'll go for one more answer. Anyone else? Yes?
Knowing what processes are represented.
Excellent answer. And the last two are things I'm going to talk about initially: processes and validation. What are the features in the real world that you want your model to reproduce, and what processes contribute to those observed features, and how do we include those processes in our model? Good answers. At least they match mine. So the outline of what I'm going to talk about, you can have your nap now. That's the end of audience participation. I'm going to talk about some large-scale ocean biogeochemical features and some of the processes that are involved with generating those observed features, some techniques that are used for modeling biological productivity in the ocean, how we assess the skill of the model. I'll talk briefly about the global carbon cycle beyond the ocean model, and then I'll wrap things up. So observations, what do we compare a model to? Here is observations of two different biogeochemical fields, nitrate, which is a nutrient in the ocean that critters use to grow, and oxygen, which photosynthetic creatures produce when they photosynthesize, and bacteria consume when they remineralize organic matter. Both of these are observations along a track in the Pacific Ocean. The Antarctica is on the left, and the Bering Sea is on the right, and the vertical axis is depth. And the little dots are where the observations have taken place. So this is from oceanographic cruises measuring all sorts of features, all sorts of quantities in the ocean. And I'm looking particularly at nitrate and oxygen concentrations. There's a lot of different things going on here that you want your model to reproduce. And there's a handful of different processes that lead to these features. And I'm going to walk through a handful of them through the picture, and then I'm going to wrap, and then I'm going to state it again with text. Some people learn visually, some people learn with text. Hopefully I get all the features right in the picture before I get to the text. Nitrate. Nitrate is what is used, it's a nutrient, it's an essential nutrient for growth. It gets absorbed assimilated into creatures' membranes, DNA. It's necessary for life. It is depleted in the near surface waters at mid-latitudes. And that is because the phytoplankton that live there have consumed all of it until it's gone. And so photosynthesis is leading to a reduction of nitrate in the near surface waters at these latitudes. It's happening in the near surface because these photosynthesizers autotrophs need light to grow. So that's only happening in the near surface waters. It's also not happening at high latitudes because there's a temperature dependence on growth. When it's really, really cold, a lot of the metabolism is slowed down, and so there's not as much consumption of the nutrients, and so you still have abundant nutrient at high latitudes. There's also some enhanced nitrate right near the low latitudes on the equator. We'll get to a moment to talk about where that's coming from. Conversely, oxygen is higher near the surface. That's where the photosynthesis consumes nutrients, consumes carbon, produces oxygen. Same thing happens with plants you look out the window. So photosynthesis is producing oxygen, consuming nutrient. Critters get eaten, they die, some stuff sinks. Is that organic matter is falling through the water column. Bacteria breaks it down, and it returns that organic matter into an inorganic form. That remineralization, that consumption of the converting that organic matter into inorganic forms consumes oxygen. So you get depleted oxygen at intermediate depths, and it reintroduces the nutrient. So you have enhanced nutrient at depth. If those were the only things going on, you would just see these nice vertical profiles. But there's meridional structure that's going on. You see less oxygen in the north than in the south, more nitrate in the north and the south at these intermediate depths. There's this large-scale overturning circulation in the ocean that's ventilating oxygen-rich and nutrients from the Antarctic down into the deep Pacific. And slowly that begins to upwell on the equator, leading to enhanced nutrients on the equator and reduced oxygen on the equator. And also it offsets the nutrients in the North Pacific and the excess in the North Pacific and the oxygen minimum in the North Pacific. So there's this overall circulation and mixing. There's vertical mixing going on as well. That explains more and more of the features. Another feature that's going on is that you can see that the oxygen, like where the nitrogen is the smallest, right? Like 20 south or 30 north, oxygen is not the largest. Oxygen is largest at those high latitudes. And another thing that's going on with oxygen is there's an exchange of oxygen between seawater and the atmosphere. There's air-sea exchange. And that depends upon the solubility of that dissolved gas within the seawater. It turns out that that depends upon temperature. Colder water holds more dissolved gas than warmer water. And so that means that as the seawater comes into an equilibrium with the atmosphere, the cold water in the high latitudes are going to have greater dissolved gases in it. And that includes oxygen, that involves carbon dioxide as well. We'll get to in the next slide. So those are some other, so I think those are the main features. And when I get to the written list, we'll see if I missed something. So that's nitrate and oxygen. Another one, which is sort of bridges the gap between the two or has some features in common, is dissolved inorganic carbon, DIC, which you can think of as dissolved CO2 gas. It's not quite dissolved CO2 gas because there's some carbonate chemistry that leads to other breakdown of dissolved gas into other carbon compounds in the ocean. But for now, just simplify things and think of it as dissolved gas. So it has the features of like a nutrient, that is, when photosynthesis happens, critters consume, they assimilate the DIC into their membranes. So it has features that are nutrient-like. That gives us that low values at the surface, higher values at depth. But it is also a dissolved gas, and so it has features like oxygen. So it has a combination of the observed features are sort of a mix between these nutrient-like patterns and the dissolved gas patterns that you see in oxygen. So you see like the high values at the low latitudes at the surface where it's consumed. You also see high values near Antarctica. You see the maximum in the North Pacific like you see for nitrate. It's a mix of features that you see with nutrients and oxygen. And CO2 is one that we care a lot about because of its big role that it plays in the climate. So a lot of the CO2 that we emit that exists in the system resides in the ocean. And so we care about having that represented well in our models. The particular sorts of features of the air-sea gas flux, this is a map, a bit dated map now, of air-sea CO2 gas flux that also shows some of those features now, not just looking at the depth latitude features, but the spatial features of it. So in the equatorial Pacific, you've got upwelling of nutrient carbon-rich waters. So that water is oversaturated when it hits the surface. It warms up from lots of solar radiation. It's cold, carbon-rich, it warms up, and then you get an outgassing of carbon into the atmosphere. That's what that red is going on in the Pacific. That's also going on at other low latitudes in other basins. Intermediate, in the intermediate latitudes, subpolar, we've got uptake of carbon from the processes that are contributing to the carbon concentration and also the solubility, temperature effect on solubility. And so all those processes are leading to these observed patterns of air-sea CO2 flux that we want to capture in our model. Now, how'd I do? Biological, so these are the text version of the biological, the primary processes governing the distribution of nutrients, oxygen, carbon, et cetera. There's biological productivity in the euphotic zone that consumes nutrients and inorganic carbon. It produces organic matter and oxygen. That organic matter is exported out of the euphotic zone. So there's circulation, large-scale circulation that moves that stuff around. There's also sinking particles from the dead critters, whether it's detritus from things that have died or things up the food chain where they poop, or calcium carbonate shells for those sorts of critters that produce shells. This is not a chalkboard, so we don't have chalk, so I can't show you a calcium carbonate shell as it exists the way we use it. There's the remineralization of that organic matter back into an inorganic form. This is essentially the reverse of productivity, and it consumes oxygen. There's the general circulation, advective transport, lateral and vertical mixing that also contribute to those distributions that we saw. And there's the temperature-dependent air-sea gas exchange. Wow, I got all of that. Good, I didn't miss anything. Those are the primary processes governing the large-scale patterns that are observed in reality, and you want to reproduce those with your models. And you want to have the processes, all those processes that I listed, you want to represent them well. There's other processes that don't play as much of a role globally, but regionally they can be very significant. One is atmospheric nutrient deposition. So you get winds blowing dust off of the Sahara into the mid-Atlantic, and that dust has iron in it. And so the Atlantic Ocean gets lots of iron deposition, which fuels growth. Iron is a micronutrient, which is also essential to biological productivity. And atmospheric nutrient deposition plays a big role in where that iron is available. So this is applicable to iron. It's also for nitrogen and phosphorus, et cetera. There's loss of biological matter to sediments. Some of that sinking matter gets to the sediments, it gets buried, and it doesn't come back into the system until a geological time scale. So it gets buried in sediments, you get tectonics that move things around, where it gets released on very long time scales. You might have riverine inputs that lead to biological fueling nutrients into the ocean, like the Amazon River dumps a huge amount of nitrate and phosphorus into the subtropical Atlantic, the tropical Atlantic. There's also nitrogen fixation, which plays a role in the nitrogen cycle, particularly at low and intermediate latitudes. This converts nitrogen gas into ammonia. Usually critters cannot use that dissolved nitrogen gas because it's not, it's hard for them to break down the nitrogen and absorb it, assimilate it into their membranes, because the triple bonds of the N2 gas takes a lot of energy to break. There's some critters that can do that though, and they are nitrogen fixers, and they play a big role in the nitrogen cycle. And there's correspondingly another feature called denitrification, which is when that bacteria decomposes organic matter into inorganic matter, and there's not enough sufficient oxygen to fuel that. They start consuming other things to fuel that decomposition, and so they might be consuming nitrate in the remineralization of organic matter, and that's denitrification, which closes the nitrogen cycle. These are other things that play a big role. I'm going to, all those processes, if you wanted to take a class in ocean biogeochemistry, you would learn about all of those processes. But this is a half-hour lecture, and so I'm not going to be able to go in depth into how we model all of those processes. I'm going to go into depth into one of them. And so to start that off, I'm going to talk about, well, what is an NPZD model? We have lots of acronyms. You've probably learned dozens and dozens of acronyms this week. Here's another one, NPZD. This stands for nutrient, phytoplankton, zooplankton, detritus. These are different sorts of pools that you model when you're modeling ocean ecosystems. This is a very simplified class of model where you have these different sorts of types of categories of boxes that you are modeling. You've got a nutrient. In this particular example, this is the FASHM model from 1990. It's a classic model that has, does my cursor work? I hope so. Yes, you've got nitrate and ammonium as nutrients. That is fueling that productivity. You've got phytoplankton here. You've got the phytoplankton consume nutrients through photosynthesis. You've got zooplankton. Those are the critters that eat the phytoplankton. They don't do photosynthesis, but they eat the phytoplankton. This model also has bacteria, which also is consuming the ammonium and nitrate and is eaten by the zooplankton. The phytoplankton and zooplankton, when they die, they are producing detritus. And all these arrows are showing flows of matter from one flow to another, and there are different processes for every single arrow in that graph, and you've got to include all of those in the model. So what is an example, now an even more simplified version of that fashion model is an NPZ model where I'm starting to show some of those processes of the arrows. So now I've dropped the D and I just have N, P, and Z. So just 3 boxes, but there's still a lot of math here. So the phytoplankton has a growth term. This first term here is representing photosynthesis. And there's all sorts of parameters. There's nutrient limitation of how when there's less nutrient, this monad function represents a reduction in photosynthesis. There's a light factor in here where the amount of light availability plays a limiting role in the growth in the photosynthesis term. There's a grazing term of how the zooplankton are eating the phytoplankton. There's a mortality term. The zooplankton grow by eating that. There's ingestion from that mortality term. This looks just like this grazing term, but it has this extra factor out here, 1A, because sometimes when the critters are eating the other critters, they don't ingest everything, and some of it, there's sloppy feeding, and some of it doesn't get ingested, some of it goes back into the seawater. The remaining of that stuff that is not ingested goes back to the nutrient pool. There's mortality terms. These mortality terms are showing up in the nutrient pool. The photosynthesis term is being drawn from the nutrient pool. So it's just this simple model has 3 coupled ordinary differential equations. Every term that is a gain in one box is a loss in another box. So you've got mass conservation. Total nutrient is consumed. This is a really simple model. But look at all the parameters in it. You've got sensitivity to light. You've got sensitivity to nutrients. You've got how much grazing is affected, what the mortality rates are, how much is ingested. I didn't recount it, but I think there's about a dozen parameters in here just for a 3-box model. How do you estimate all of those? And there's lots of different approaches that you take when you're a modeler. Some you go to the lab or you read papers by people who did stuff in the lab. I'm a mathematician, so I don't actually go into a lab. I just read papers by people that work in the lab. They do incubation experiments where they look at the response of photosynthesis to irradiance. They look at nutrient uptake with different experiments. And they do this out in the lab. They do this in the field out on a ship. They get stuff, take samples and bring it onto the shipboard and do experiments on the ship or look at in situ observations. Some of this, we're characterizing lots of different species of phytoplankton into one box, into one category, and so we sort of optimize tune our parameters until the results of the model look like field data. Or sometimes we just use the values that we used in the earlier generation of the model. There's lots of different approaches for generating all of those parameters, and in practice we do a combination of these in our modeling efforts. I mentioned that one of the ways that we need to combine those, that we need to optimize these parameters is because we're taking one phytoplankton box to represent 1,000 different species of phytoplankton. Maybe we've got like 4 or 5 different plankton classes in our model, but there's really thousands of different species that have all sorts of nutrient affinities and responses to light or different ways that they can protect themselves against predation. But we're lumping all of those into smaller boxes, and so we sort of have to aggregate them into these boxes based upon different types of traits so that it makes sense to group them into these what we call plankton functional types. And if you're a land modeler, this sounds a lot like plant functional types, and it is very similar. So don't be surprised that it's the same acronym, even though it's a different word for the letter P. The way that we can group them together is based upon the sort of biogeochemical roles that they play. Maybe they make calcium carbonate shells whereas others don't, or you've got diatoms that make these silica-based shells, which are really, really beautiful shells. Maybe they have particular nutrient requirements, like the phytoplankton that can do that nitrogen fixation that I mentioned. They require a lot of iron, and so they only thrive when they have a huge iron requirement. So these are the sorts of things we group things together. So how many plankton functional types do you need in your model? This is one of my favorite models. This is one of my favorite papers written by a colleague that I know, Marjorie Friedrichs at Virginia Institute of Marine Sciences. She took a dozen different models of varying complexities and tested some hypotheses for how complicated of a model do you need to do different things. What she did with these dozen models is she got them contributed from different people in the community. She ran these models in 2 different ecological provinces in the ocean. EP stands for Equatorial Pacific, AS stands for Arabian Sea. Very different biogeochemical situations. And she first, in this cost, these plots are this first cost, high values are bad, the model is mismatching observations. She took the models as they were given to her and ran them. In the models, the results were all over the map initially when she untuned, where they were not tuned. And they are sorted in terms of increasing complexity from left to right. The more complex models did better than the less complex models when she didn't tune them. But when she tuned them, she did some optimization on the different parameters. They all did pretty well if you tuned for the Equatorial Pacific or tuned for the Arabian Sea. So if all you care about is the Equatorial Pacific, you can get away with the simple model. You don't need the complicated model that is more expensive to run. The next set of experiments, and then if you run the same model in the Arabian Sea and you retune it, and all you care about is the Arabian Sea, you can do just as well with the low complexity model as you can with the high complexity model. But what if you want to run them at both places? So what Margie did was tune the models for both sites simultaneously. Then you start to see a benefit. Even though they're tuned, the more complicated models did a better job of reproducing the observations than the low complexity models. So if you want one model to work in multiple places, like we do in a global model like CESM, that high complexity model is giving you a benefit. Another thing that's going on is, well, what if you tune for one location and you run it at another location? And an example of twisting that a little bit is that what if you run it for today's climate and you run it for a future climate? What this last experiment shows, it's an analogous sort of experiment, but what Margie showed is if you run it at one site with tuning from the other, the more complicated models tended to do better. So there's a benefit to having that higher cost model if that's the sort of thing you're doing. But what model is best depends upon what you're doing. If all you care about is the Equatorial Pacific today, then you can get away with the low-cost model. But if you care about a global model that you want to run today and tomorrow, then you're going to get some benefit from that more complicated model. What does our model in CESM look like? I should have updated this slide. The BEC acronym is an older acronym that we use for the ocean biogeochemistry model in CESM. Now we call it MARBLE for the Marine Biogeochemical Library, which is documented in this Long et al. James paper. So this has that, these are the boxes that are represented in the CESM ocean biogeochemistry model. We have phytoplankton. We have a few different classes of phytoplankton. We have zooplankton, which we have a single zooplankton class which grazes on the phytoplankton. We have detritus. We have suspended DOM, dissolved organic matter. We have large detritus, which sinks instantaneously. We have inorganic tracers, some of which are nutrients and some of which are DIC in alkalinity, and we have chlorophyll. And all of these arrows represent the major processes in the model that we represent these processes in the model. As textually speaking, the primary features are that we've got these 4 major nutrients, like most sort of state-of-the-art models at the climate that are run at the climate level: nitrogen, phosphorus, silica, and iron. We have 4 different plankton functional groups, 3 autotrophs and 1 grazer. In CESM3, we're going to move to 4 autotrophs and 2 grazers. That's giving us better results in developmental versions. In this version of the model that is involved CESM2, we have implicit coccolithophores that calcify. We've got explicitly modeled coccolithophores in CESM3. We've got fixed carbon to nitro ratios in plankton. That might be variable in CESM3, and variable ratios for other constituents. And there's an iron binding ligand, which leads to a better representation of the iron cycle. Iron cycling in the ocean is incredibly complicated. There's lots of fascinating chemistry that goes on there. And this ligand and the different types of iron, there's a lot to go there in the processes. Because we're running this climate model, there's some constraints on what we have in terms of computational cost, and there's some features that we don't have in earlier versions of the model. Some of these which are being remedied in CESM3, which is under development now. Calcification and calcium carbonate dissolution is independent of the carbonate saturation state. That's being improved in CESM3. Riverine inputs of BGC tracers are prescribed. We're not coupled to a land model. That's going to be the case in CESM3 too. The stuff that's buried to the sediments is just lost from the system. Poof, it's gone. It's like it never existed. We don't have a routing back into the system. That's going to be the case in CESM3. There's no treatment of BGC in the sea ice model of CESM2. We're hoping to have that in CESM3. And the focus on the BGC model, ocean BGC model in CESM is on the lower trophic levels because it's a climate model primarily, and so we care about the impact of those lower trophic levels on atmospheric CO2 levels because it's a climate model. CO2 is relevant. We don't have a strong representation of higher trophic levels that might matter, for instance, to fishery work, though we do have fisheries-related projects outside of our mainline runs. How do we validate our model? What are some examples of the data sets that we look at to validate the model? Some are the macronutrients, phosphate, nitrate, silicate, and also dissolved oxygen from the World Ocean Atlas. This is a gridded data product from millions of observations that have been taken all around the world in different ocean basins, as well as DIC and alkalinity from the GLODAP analysis, another gridded product. We compare the modeled prediction of chlorophyll to satellites. Back in the 70s, they started flying satellites that could observe chlorophyll and getting amazing pictures of chlorophyll from space. So you don't just need to rely on the ship can go from here to here to here and you get scattered observations. You look at from space, you get a whole much better view of what's going on, except for clouds. We compare our model to satellite observations of chlorophyll, as well as productivity estimated from satellites. The satellite can't measure productivity itself, but there are a handful of algorithms that can compute that productivity from the observed chlorophyll and other features of the ocean. There are direct measurements of partial pressure of CO2 and CO2 flux in seawater all around the world. And there are some projects that have filled that to a global gridded data set with neural nets that we compare our models to. And then there are databases of iron that we can compare our ocean model to. These are just examples of the data sets that we use to validate the model. And then that gives us confidence that the model is appropriate for studying these in other climate regimes and future projections. An example from the Long et al. Paper of 2021, looking at the Marble biogeochemistry library, is looking at the air-sea CO2 flux from this neural net gap-filled model of CO2 flux. Looking at the end of the 20th century, then the top is CESM2 results from this long paper. And not that it's a long paper, but that's the author's name. And this is comparing it to the neural net-filled product. And we get the main features reasonably correct. And the integrated flux was a little bit off compared to the observations. It's not a perfect model. No model is perfect. So this is just looking at an annual mean. And then looking to the right is looking at a zonal average with the seasonal cycle. So that we're looking at what's the seasonal cycle of the CO2 fluxes in different latitude bands. And then on the far right is the zonal integral, zonal average for the year. So you can see that we're getting a decent job of reproducing the seasonal cycle and that the zonal averages are reasonably capturing the observations. What are some known challenges with this whole approach of what we have in our model? We've got these BGC parameters where we have now, with the complications of our full-blown model, hundreds of parameters. It's hard to optimize these parameters. because we've got these functional groups that have all these parameters. It's too much to optimize explicitly, so there's a lot of hand tuning from experts. And then another catch is that the ocean simulation of the physics itself is not perfect. So you don't want to overtune the BGC parameters to overcompensate for deficiencies in the ocean model circulation. That's another challenge. Another is that when you're comparing to observations, is that the model is not spun up. And given BGC models in physical circulation, getting a balanced state that you can compare to observations takes a really long time to spin up the ocean model, because the deepest parts of the ocean take thousands of years to equilibrate, whereas you've got some processes like photosynthesis that happen at diurnal timescales. There's active research using spin-up techniques to try to do this more efficiently. As a mathematician, that's the kind of thing that I spend a lot of time working on myself. I'm going to transition into talking about the global carbon cycle. And I'm at the end of my time, so I'm going to do this super fast. I've taken out some slides too. The ocean carbon cycle is a part of the global carbon cycle. This is showing carbon reservoirs in the ocean, atmosphere, and land. These black numbers are showing inventory of carbon, 38,000 petagrams carbon in the ocean compared to 3,800 in the plants and soil, or 590 in the atmosphere. The ocean has a lot of carbon in it, a whole lot more than the other reservoirs. And so that's why we care about the ocean carbon and its impact on atmospheric CO2. These arrows represent, with these different large-scale exchanges, that's the flux of carbon from the different reservoirs in terms of petagrams carbon per year at a pre-industrial state and with an anthropogenic perturbation. We compare our model to observations. And so if we run like a 20th century simulation with CESM2, this is from versions in CESM 1.2, looking at the fluxes of CO2 into the atmosphere from the different reservoirs. And the gray bars are observational constraints. So what you can see here in this first top left panel top right is fossil fuels. This is prescribed, so we better get that right. Because if that's not matching observations, then that just says we're using the wrong data set. So we're getting a decent job of representing that fossil fuel flux. This bottom left is the ocean uptake of carbon dioxide compared to the observations. We were close to obs. We were a little bit weak compared to observational constraints. In the land, fluxes were really, really good. In earlier versions, the land flux was way off, and the land modelers put in a lot of effort after CESM1 and improved this greatly. Another thing we look at is the seasonal cycle of atmospheric CO2. As all those different processes contribute, this is largely controlled by the terrestrial carbon cycle. So if you look at what is the modeled atmospheric CO2 at Point Barrow, Alaska, this is on the north slope of Alaska, comparing to a particular observational data set. And then these are two different sorts of model simulations. We were doing pretty good at reproducing the seasonal cycle at Point Barrow. At Mauna Loa, Hawaii, this is capturing most large-scale boreal forest is a big part of this signal. At Mauna Loa, there's also a seasonal cycle of atmospheric CO2. This is a lot of northern hemispheric productivity. Our representation was a little bit weak compared to observations. We don't quite have big enough seasonal cycle at Mauna Loa. We were doing pretty well at Palmer Station in Antarctica and also the South Pole. The phasing at the South Pole was a little bit off. I'm not going to go a lot into carbon cycle science in Earth system models as a general. And so if you really want to dig into literature, here's a subset of the vast literature of carbon cycle and Earth system models, some CMIP 4, 5, and 6, with different, and this one is a link to a whole bunch of different papers on the carbon cycle in CMIP 6 models, looking at the evaluation, looking at emissions that are compatible with prescribed concentrations, different sorts of feedbacks and emergent constraints. There's a vast literature which is growing. This is just a subset of it, that if you're interested in this sort of field, here's some stuff that you can dig into. So to wrap things up, large-scale ocean biogeochemical features are determined by a handful of processes that we include into our model. The perfect model doesn't exist. We do lots of simplifications, but we sort of tune our models to work particularly on the types of problems that we're using our model to study. And that's an important thing to know when you're using a model is it the right tool for your research question? There's not a perfect model, but there is a good fit for the model to your science. The global carbon cycle is now present in many CMIP class models, and people are validating those on multiple timescales. In the literature is growing, looking at the impact of climate change on these fluxes, and the literature is vastly growing. The practical notes for activating the prognostic carbon cycle are in the BGC challenge exercises that you will get to later today if that's something of interest to you. So that wraps things up.
All right. Thank you, Keith. So we have a few questions.
Thank you very much for this great presentation. My question is mainly related to the half-life time of these suspended substances, even in water. So I didn't see any term related to the half-life time or the time for this substance to decay and then go back to the atmosphere through circulation. So could you please explain why there is no term or parameter related to the lifetime of this substance?
So are you referring to radiocarbon, or what are you talking? The half-life of which substance? I wasn't quite clear
Like
on that.
nutrients and all dissolved substances in the water.
So most of the nutrients are just being processed, and so it's not just with a lifetime that then decays back into an organic form. There are processes that capture that, and so the different processes have different time scales. Like the bacterial breakdown of organic matter is based upon environmental conditions, and so we include a parameterization of the time scales of those processes in the model. I think that's what you're.
I didn't see any term in NPD model in the equations mainly related to the time. So there is no time here because the decay takes time. For example, dp by dt means time. So
I think the examples I gave were pretty simplified, and so I didn't give the full. I don't have all the equations up for the full complicated model. That long paper has a lot of the details for the full model that we have in CESM. But yeah, the simple models don't have an explicit representation that I included there just for this talk. Don't have all of those processes. But we have a lot of those processes in the more complicated model, but that gets to be too much to include in this amount of time.
okay,
But that's a good point, though.
And I think, as you mentioned, some of the things like remineral or after things get deposited, they don't go back into the atmosphere, but that might be coming in later models.
Yes,
So,
that's
all right, next question.
Thank you for the interesting talk. So I know that these phytoplanktons act as tracers and they depict good signature of mesoscale eddies or coastal and equatorial Kelvin waves. And so I was wondering, since the coastal phenomena are also affected by riverine discharge, so why don't the equations involve any dynamical term or any dynamics in them?
That's a great question. In the box model equations that I was showing, I did not include the terms for advective transport or mixing by eddies or by vertical turbulence. Those were just the simplified version of what's going on in a Lagrangian parcel. In the full-blown ocean model, you do have these other processes of the advective transport or the mixing by mesoscale eddies or mixing in nearshore processes or turbulence in the vertical. Those are all present in the full-blown model. I was just focusing on what are the biogeochemical processes that happen in a Lagrangian parcel. Your totally valid point that those were a much simplified version of what's going on in the full version of the model.
Okay, thank you.
All right, who else has questions?
Thank you, Keith, for your fascinating lecture. I was just wondering how the river flows are received by the model, particularly in the context of algal blooms or marine anoxia.
Great question. In our version with CESM, we are reading a data set of prescribed riverine fluxes. So for the 20th century, we do have those do have an anthropogenic component to them. And so there's enhanced nitrogen content in river flows, particularly downstream of large agricultural regions. And that is just a flux of nutrients into the surface waters, which then the biology receives that nutrient and that spurs productivity. That is not coupled to processes modeled by the land model. We're just reading a data set that has that anthropogenic component in it in a pre-industrial steady state sort of flux. That is a gap in the model that we don't have that prognostic coupling. And I'm not sure that that's going to be, there's some talk about getting dissolved organic matter. There's potential for that in CESM3, but I think the land modelers have a lot on their plate. I'm not sure if that's going to make it in time.
Thank you.
So was there a question back here?
Okay. Thank you for a great talk. I have several questions. The first one is CSM model estimated active nitrogen extremely less than the measurement of some campaigns. And I'm wondering if you could explain about some sources of nitrogen that not considered in the model.
I didn't quite catch the first, the efficiency of the model that you were referring to. I didn't quite.
The measurement of the campaign, the field campaign, is lower than, higher than the estimate of the model. And I'm wondering if you have any explanation about what's the difference? Is there any sources that model didn't consider?
Of nitrogen in particular?
Yes, exactly.
What gaps do we have in the model? We do have atmospheric nitrogen deposition that we are reading from, well, actually now we're getting that from the atmospheric model. We do not have a full nitrogen cycle in the model. So for instance, we don't have NOx production. When we do denitrification, the closure of the nitrogen cycle to dissolve nitrogen gas, we don't have all aspects of that represented in the model, but I think we've got the main processes from denitrification to nitrogen fixation to atmospheric deposition. But we have the processes, but there are gaps in the modeling of those processes. So some of that is also there's circulation that plays a role in terms of the nitrogen. It plays a big role in the simulated results of the nitrogen species within the ocean model. I think we've got the major processes included in the model, but I think there is certainly room for improvement in the modeling of those processes. I'm not sure which campaign you're referring to in particular, so there might be some processes regionally that we're missing in the particular campaign you're talking about that I'm not familiar with. I'd be happy to talk with you more about that.
Yeah, do we consider nitrogen fixation in the model or not?
Yes, we do have nitrogen fixation. So that happens primarily at low latitudes when there's sufficient iron, but that is considered in the model.
Yeah,
I'm gonna say maybe you can talk to him real quick. I want to give you guys at least a 5-minute break if you need to top up on coffee or run to the restroom. So let's go ahead and take that break now. And why don't you come down and talk to Keith?
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so I'm sorry that was a short break. It was mostly my fault for going long before Keith started, but I wanted you to at least have a short break. So our next lecture is going to be given by Gunter Legee. You can see he's virtual. He is on a different work-related trip this week, but he graciously has agreed to give this lecture remotely. He's in the land ice modeling section here at NCAR. In his deeper past, I think he did sea ice modeling as well, and he's going to be talking to us, though, about that land ice component. All right, go ahead, Gunter.
Thank you, and I hope you can hear me okay.
Yes, we can.
I take this as a yes. All right, that sounds good. Good morning, everybody. I hope you have enjoyed this week. As Alice mentioned, my name is Gunter Legee. I'm a land ice modeler at NCAR. I've started at NCAR about 6 years ago now, and I'm going to talk to you more about land ice modeling in CESM. The outline of this next half hour, I'm going to try to give you a little bit of background on land ice and sea level rise, and then tell you more about the ice sheet in the community air system models that you've been learning about throughout this week. Talk a little bit about contribution of CSM to CMIP 6 and our future plans in ice sheet model development. Everything that I'm going to talk about is not my own work by far. There's a lot of contribution from Bill Lipscomb, another scientist at NCAR, Mia Bedard, Sarah Bradley, and others that made this presentation possible, and the science ongoing at NCAR. So when we think about land ice first, the scientific aspect that we think about is primarily sea level rise. And there are three main drivers of sea level rise right now. As thermal expansions, the melting of glaciers, and then the melting of ice sheets. You can see, I don't know if my mouse works here. Can you see my cursor or not at all?
Sorry, we cannot see your cursor.
No.
I'm sorry.
No, okay. So I will not use my mouse.
I can go up there and try to point where you want me to, Gunter.
No, that's going to be okay because I cannot see your screen in my presentation. But that's fine. What you're seeing on the time series on the right-hand side is a sea level change since 1900 that goes all the way to more or less present. And for between 1900 and 1990, you can see that sea level was already changing and rising, and the cause of this change was primarily due to summer expansion and melt of glaciers. And since the 1990s, the ice sheets now have started to contribute as well to the signal, and the contribution has catch up to be equally or more than the contribution of the summer expansion and glaciers. We have now an increase of sea level change, of sea level rise around the world that's exceeding 2 millimeters a year, and the main contributor of this is becoming, from the two ice sheets, becoming Greenland. When we think about sea level, we don't necessarily, we always have this big picture that once sea level changes, then it equalizes around the world, and then it gets distributed evenly. Well, that's not true. We have what is called, and it varies because of land subsidence, glacier rebounds, ocean circulation changes, and changes in ice sheet self-gravity. And this is known as glacial isostatic adjustment, or GIA. And you can see on the left-hand side, panel C and D here, that whenever Antarctica is losing mass, you actually see a sea level decline around Antarctica, and then you have the northern hemisphere is way more impacted compared to the southern hemisphere. On the opposite side, on the D panel, you can see that when Greenland is contributing a lot to sea level rise and loses mass, you have a sea level decline around Greenland, and the southern hemisphere is way more impacted. So if you live in the eastern part of the United States, you might want to cheer up for contribution to Greenland as opposed to Antarctica, as you would feel less sea level change compared to the South America, for example. On the right-hand side, you can see map of the continental US, and that sea level changes has varied non-uniformly across the United States. There are two contemporary ice sheets currently, the Greenland ice sheet and the Antarctic ice sheets. They are both made of ice, but they are driving, the dynamic is driven by different processes. The Greenland ice sheet on the left-hand side here has an equivalent of 7 meters of sea level, and it gains mass by snowfall, but it's mainly balanced by surface runoff and iceberg calving. And right now it's losing mass at a rate of 270 gigatons a year, which is about 2/3 of a millimeter of sea level equivalent. And then on the right hand side, you have the Antarctic ice sheets, which has an equivalent of 58 meters of sea level rise, and it gains mass by snowfall, just like the Greenland ice sheet. 1 minute. And but it's losing mass by iceberg calving and basal melting from the big ice shelves that are present in Antarctica, not so much by surface melting. And right now, for the past 20 years, its contribution to sea level has been of about 150 gigatons a year, which is about 0.4 millimeters a year. Mountain glaciers. The glaciers outside of the two ice sheets that contain an equivalent of about 0.5 meter of sea level equivalent. Most of the glaciers, as you can see on the top right figure, most glacier volume is located in the Canadian Arctic, in Russia, Greenland periphery in Alaska, and the Antarctic periphery in high mountain Asia. The volume is small compared to the ice sheets, but currently the contribution to sea level is of about 230 gigatons a year, so it's similar to the contribution of the Greenland ice sheets. And the importance also lie outside of the sea level domain, as they're crucial for water supplies and freshwater supply, and trigger outburst flooding. And this goes into, along with sea level, into another topic that you'll hear a little bit later by Monica Morrison of climate justice. Glaciers. They move. They move sometimes faster than one thinks. The way they move is due to the force of gravity. So gravity is driving their process. If you think about a glacier and how they move, think about very thick, cold honey. And this is how we picture it, and this is how we actually model it into CSM. In this, in the picture that you see, this flowline model, if you simplify the forces applied on the ice, you have internal deformation of the ice, you have the driving stress that is caused by gravity, and then you have the basal stress at the bottom of the bed, and you also have buttressing on the side. And in the interior of the ice sheet, the ice is frozen at the bed, and it moves very slowly. And there is an approximation that we typically call the shallow ice approximation that is very good in modeling this type of behavior. However, at some point, water can get into the bed and lubricate the bed to speed up the glacier and provide basal sliding. And this process is best described by the Shallow-Schaff approximation. If you do not want to make any of these approximations, then you need to go into more complicated model. And this is when you use a Stokes equation or higher order approximations. And I'll get to this a little bit later. When the bed is well lubricated, the glaciers can slide at speeds that are exceeding several kilometers a year. Glaciers, they gain and lose mass. It's on the ice, compact becomes ice. It loses mass, surface melt, basal melt, and calving. And the difference between the snowfall, the mass that the glacier accumulates and the one that it loses, it's called the mass balance. In Antarctica, mainly the processes of losing mass are calving and basal melting, very little surface melting. It's about a 50-50 contribution of each process. So what we understand the surface mass balance changes pretty well. We're still not still do not understand quite well the changing dynamics such as social interaction or rapid sliding, very rapid sliding events when there's very little resistance at the bed. That's still work in progress. Now, carbon dioxide, temperature, and sea level are linked together. And what you're looking at here, the time series of the past 400,000 years. It's a reconstruction based on data, and you can see. So the top the top subplot is the concentration of CO2. The scale is not down to zero. In the middle, you have the temperature anomaly, and you have the sea level change. That is throughout this period. So I don't have a cursor, but there are different times that are highlighted here. The Eemian or the last interglacial, that was about 130,000 years ago, and the Holocene that was about 17,000 years ago. Sea level rose up to 4 meters per century during the last deglaciation, so about 17,000 years ago. And cool accumulate, build up gradually over 100,000 years until reaching the last glacial maximum. And then there's a sudden deglaciation that comes from 20,000 years ago to 10,000 years ago. That followed by the Holocene for 10,000 years. And the difference that in the processes during these times is that the temperature and CO2 fed back positively on each other. And warm temperature meant lower solubility of CO2 in the ocean and also increased upwelling of CO2 from deep ocean. So more goes to the atmosphere. So now what is different is that CO2 is the main driver of the sea level change that we're observing. And you can see close to the zero axis on the right-hand side, there's an abrupt increase in CO2 concentration. Ice sheets, as you may know, build up very slowly, but they can melt very quickly. There are different ice sheets during other warm climates. Still, Greenland and Antarctica was there. During the last interglacial around 25,000 years ago, we had the temperature was 2 degrees warmer compared to today, but the CO2 concentration was lower. It was more equivalent to what we have at the pre-industrial, but the global sea level was 6 to 9 meters higher, and we know that Greenland contributed 2 to 4 meters of the 6 to 9 meter higher sea level rise. So what we're trying to understand right now is how Antarctica could have contributed to this number, and if we do the math here, we need to look for 2 to 5 meters. And we're still trying to understand what are the processes that were involved in the Antarctic contribution. During the Pliocene, 3 million years ago, we had a 2 to 3 degree warming compared to today. But with a CO2 concentration of 400 parts per million, which is closer to what we're experiencing right now, and global sea level was 5 to 20 meters higher. So we know that we could get up to 7 meters from Greenland and 5 meters from the West Antarctic ice sheet. Antarctic ice sheet to get to that number. So the reason why we're interested into these processes so far back in time is that by trying to understand the past, we could potentially understand the future. And this is a work that we are highly actively working on with the Paleoclimate Working Group. I mentioned earlier, ice sheets can lose mass, and in particular in Antarctica, you have the connection with the ocean. So on the left-hand side here, you are actually looking at the Antarctic basal topography, and the blue color means that the bed lies below sea level. And when you have an ice sheet that is on such a bed, it's called a marine ice sheet, and it has some contact with the ocean. It is currently below sea level. So you have this vulnerable, which are warm waters from the ocean. And right now, especially in the Amundsen Sea, you might have heard about the Doomsday Glacier and the Thwaites Glacier, which is the Thwaites Glacier, which is very close to getting unstable. On the right-hand side here, you have a profile of a picture where you have this ice shelf. So ice shelf is a floating ice, and you can see that this black box, which highlights the point where the ice is gone and becomes a float. It's also called a ring line. And you have an example of a bed here that is sloping downwards while towards the interior of the ice sheet. And we call this a retrograde bed. And when the grounding line sits on such a sloped bed, you have warm water that is pressing or is reduced, then you have what is called the marine ice sheet instability. Is that as the grounding, you have a larger amount of ice downward and carve, and which is a marine ice sheet instability that is very hard to stop. So the Thwaites Glacier is in such a condition right now, and once it reaches this unstable phase, then it would be very hard to stop. The sea level contribution of this could be up to 3 meters in the future. Now, ice sheet in Earth system models. So for many years, global climate model lacked dynamic ice sheets, and there are more climate models. And before CSM started, CSM was actually called CCSM, the Community Climate System Model. And then they started to add biosphere chemistry and ice sheets. So this is when it became this Community Earth System Model. So the question was at the time, why not ice sheets? Ice sheets are pretty cool. They're actually important in the climate system. And you can answer very cool climate science question with them. Before they were included, ice sheets to change. And so the assumption of fixed boundary between land and atmosphere. And now we realize that it's it's a bit more complicated and they matter a little bit more. So during CSM1 in 2010, this is when the ice sheet were introduced, and we started this with a Greenland ice sheet. And the way it works is we divide the labor. The community land model computes the surface mass balance that I talked about earlier to force the ice sheets and using subgrid elevation tiles to make up for coarse resolution. So you have a coupler between the land and the ice sheet that remaps the surface mass balance to a finer grid, and the remapping is a downscaling process. And CESM, which is the ice sheet model for CSM right now, computes the ice flow and the dynamics. At the time, it was a simplistic model in the sense that we were using a shallow ice dynamics. So we were not doing a good job in modeling fast evolving ice. It was for Greenland only, and it was only a one-way coupling in the sense that the ice sheet was not evolving dynamically, and the community system model would not see these changes. But at least it would give elevation. It would provide elevation differences of the Greenland ice sheet. Recently, 5 years ago, we released a CSM2, and there's some changes. And we improved the realism of the model, which is valid for both fast flowing and slow flowing. We added two-way coupling, means that and feedback on the climate. The ice sheet extent can move, and the land sees it. On the right-hand side here, you see a little schematic of the different approximation that we use to solve the ice dynamic. And you have the shallow ice approximation and shallow shelf approximations that are cheap to solve and are created in some part of the ice. But then you can move up to the Stokes approximation where you resolve a full 3D model, but it's very expensive. So what we do, and when you run with an evolving ice sheet in CSM2, you actually run with what we call the depth integrated higher order dynamic, which combines both, has some different properties, makes the model like pretty accurate compared to higher order models, and pretty efficient in terms of computational cost. So as I was mentioning, CSM2 supports interactive coupling between the green and ice sheet and the land and atmosphere. So by default, when you run a case, the ice sheet is fixed, it's not evolving, but you can evolve the ice sheet in a two-way coupling way. The surface mass balance, pass it to CESM. CESM will return a new ice sheet in area elevation and different maps, masks of where the ice sheet is, where vegetation can be, and et cetera, et cetera. And the land types can evolve dynamically between a glaciated cell or vegetated cell and others, and which is very important for albedo feedback. This will includes improved physics for snow and fern, and compared to CSM1, and with the acid representation has been greatly improved since CSM1. This is more the schematic of what happens within CSM and the different and how the different components interact. And this pretty much shows how the different component communicate with the coupler. So as I was saying, the ice sheet communicates with the land. I didn't talk about the atmosphere. That's because the ice sheet doesn't see anything from the atmospheric model. It only communicate with the land model. So this means once in a while, the atmosphere needs to know if the ice sheet has evolved to update its topography on top of the ice sheet. And so you can do an offline update. This is why you have this big arrow going from the ice sheet to the atmosphere to tell the atmosphere about these changes, because the land is not going to communicate this to the atmosphere. In terms of coupling, so the land sends to the ice sheet surface mass balance, surface elevation, and surface temperature. The ice sheet sends to the land the ice extent and the ice surface elevation, and then the ice sheet when sends solid and liquid fluxes to the ocean. So the solid flux is due to the calving, and the liquid flux is from basal and surface melt. And the ice sheet on offline coupling, this is optional. It doesn't happen automatically, but updates the topography. What you're looking at here is a comparison of Greenland surface mass balance in CSM2. And what you have on this figure on the left-hand side is a representation of the surface mass balance from a regional climate model called RACMO, and the equivalent from CSM2. So you can see that overall, CSM2 is doing a pretty good job compared to RACMO. But what we are still, there's still a strong bias in the southeast of Greenland, where we have too much of an accumulation due to too much snowfall. So this is a bias. This is a strong bias that we are still working on correcting. It's hard to correct, and we hope that with a new snow model that is coming to the land model and different resolution technique, we can improve upon that. Oh, and I should say we're going, for those of you who are going to do the land ice exercise this afternoon, we can you can see you'll be able to experience the consequence of this bias. We have been contributing to the ice sheet model intercomparison project for CMIP6, called also SMIP6, that you might be familiar with. The goal of SMIP6, which was the first SMIP6 project focused on ice sheet, was to analyze ice sheet relevant results from standard climate model with fixed ice sheets, run standalone ice sheet experiments for Greenland and Antarctica using atmosphere and ocean forcing derived from SMIP6 model, and estimate future sea level. And there's also one project to couple climate ice sheet experiments to explore feedback within our system models. CESM was the first to publish an SMIP6 run with IGIF. The side 100 in 2. So we let this rise. So during this intergrunan ice sheet, we ice sheet margin in the land model. There's some ice model, and we were evolving the atmosphere geography. You can see that happens near the margin with increased melting. That's represented in blue here on the figure. It's the anomaly is the difference with respect to the contemporary state. You have some modest increase in interior snowfall, but the global mean sea level rose by 1100 millimeters by 2100. And again, this afternoon we'll look at this a little bit more and what it means. We contribute to the standalone ice sheet model with Greenland and Antarctica. So you have a sense of the Greenland projection on the right-hand side and Antarctic results on the right-hand side here. These experiments were forced by global climate model for outputs to 2100. And what you're looking at on the right-hand side here is the average and the spread of the different model participating to this experiment. And you can see that overall the spread of uncertainty between the different ice model is relatively small, with a sea level rise by 2100 being 32 millimeters plus or minus 17 under SCP 2.6 scenario, and 90 millimeters plus or minus 50 millimeters under SCP 8.5. So this was all due to increased surface melting, and so as I said, model overall had a good agreement. This is not the case for Antarctic ice sheets. Antarctic ice sheet and the peninsula are separated. So there's a good agreement in the peninsula, but when it comes to the East Antarctic ice sheet and the West Antarctic ice sheets, models have very wide projection, especially in the high forcing scenario, SCP 8.5, as you are seeing here. And this was mainly due to our lack of understanding in ice-ocean interaction, but also due to the initialization process of the Antarctic ice sheet. We ran a study using standard CESM that ran with Biliskin and I, that ran to 2500. And the reason for this is because when we ran those experiments to 2100 with this MIP6, there was, over the last 15 years of the experiment, this is when we started to see a sea level response that were growing faster and faster. And so we wanted to see what happened if we were to keep this forcing going. And when we ran with a couple of, what you're seeing is here as a result, with a couple of climate model forcing with different ocean parameterization. I'm not going to go into the details because it doesn't, for matter of time. And what you see here is that the Ross, the two big red areas are ice shelves in Antarctica, the one on the top of the figure is the Roni-Filchner ice shelf, and the one at the lower part is the Ross ice shelf. And you can see that they're being melted from those ocean forcing a lot during these experiments. And this might be a problem due to the interpolation that we do of the ocean forcing under the ice shelves, because we don't have subshelf cavities in the model of ocean circulation in the subshelf cavities. What we do is that we take the ocean basal melt rate at the ice shelf front and we extrapolate them. That this was the best we can do, and we're still working on this. But if this were to be realistic, then sea level will rise between 150 millimeters to up to 1.5 meters. We also did a synthetic experiment to see what would happen if we were to increase the ocean temperature in the Amundsen Sea sector, where the Thwaites Glacier is, by 2 degrees. And what you're looking at here on the right-hand side, the dark gray black is the bed topography and the depths of it. So you can see how it goes down to 1,500 meter below sea level. And those colors here is a grounding line position at different years. The purple one is 2,100 years at year 2,100. The blue, the cyan one is 2,200, and so on till 2,500. And you can what you see from this picture is that there's very modest retreat of the grounding line during the first 200 years before it really retreats rapidly, and the entire Thwaites Glacier collapse, leading to a sea level of contribution of more than 3 meters. And if you look carefully between the blue line and the purple line, there's a little bit of also orange line. And over there, there's a pinning point. A pinning point is a bed feature that rises up on which an ice shelf can really hold on to, and that prevents a collapse. It's a stabilizing point. And once the ice leaves this point, there's MISI is triggered, and there's very little way to stop this collapse. We also ran some copper green simulation of the last interglacial. This was a work done by Alias Summers. And we were trying to see if we were able to reproduce some experiment mimicking the green ice sheet during this time. And you can see here, this was run using a 1 degree CSM2 model for 8,000 years. This was accelerated. This used an accelerated ice sheet. So for every year of atmospheric model, we ran 5 years of the ice sheet model, and you can see the evolution every 2,000 years. And from 127K until 121K, the ice was losing mass to then regain some and start to grow again after 121K. And during this process, Greenland lost 4 meter sea level equivalent over 5,000 years. And this simulation was done by updating the vegetation as we go along. The vegetation changes as the ice disappears from a land scale, and we use the biome 4 vegetation model to update the vegetation every 500 years. And this has a positive feedback due to albedo. The vegetation has a low albedo, which leads to increased local warming, and that feeds back into the system. I'm looking at the time here, and so I'm going to, okay. We also run other ice sheets, paleo ice sheets. This is a picture of the Laurentide ice sheets, and this was a work done by Sarah Bradley and that we collaborated with, and a pretty reasonable comparison of the CESM is capable of representing this ice sheet pretty well compared to what we know of it, due to improved basal hydrology, steep gradient topography, and basal till. For the matter of time, I'm going to skip this. This just shows that you can reach complete deglaciation of the Greenland ice sheet under a 4 times CO2 scenario within 1,700 years. and there's even a movie, and I think you'll have access to the slide later on, and feel free to watch the movie at your later time. Within CESM now, we are also simulating mountain glaciers. This is very recent, and this is work that we have started with Samaminala. And we also use a variable resolution CESM, which Adam Harrington is going to tell you about in a little bit, to increase the resolution of CESM over the high mountain Asia. And you have a picture on the left-hand side here. We increase the resolution to 7 kilometers. It was a first attempt. We had strong biases. There's too little snowfall during this experiment. That's still something we're working on. On the two other plots that you see is a simulation of CESM and the Everest region, and this was done at 100-meter resolution in CESM. It's in Nepal glaciers, and you can see that CESM is doing, for first attempt, was doing a good job of representing here the ice speed, the surface ice speed of the ice. There's still a work in progress. We are also actively working on Antarctic coupling and ice ocean interaction. This was something that we did with Gustavo Marquez and Alparo Tentas. This is an idealized test case where we let ocean circulate under an ice shelf cavity and see how it interacts with the ice sheet. It was possible to do so because we were able to have high enough ocean resolution there. And this ice-ocean interaction is something that we're actively working and we will deliver for CESM 3, but also CESM 3. And what is happening right now is that the resolution of the ocean does not allow us to do so. But by increasing the resolution to 1/12 of a degree, we should be able to hopefully change that. Our plans in the future is to not only support the Greenland ice sheet, but also support the Antarctic ice sheet out of the box without strong changes in the configuration or the code itself. We also added support for running multiple ice sheets within CESM. In a single simulation, this was work done primarily by Bill Sachs and Marina Wertenstein. And this is a feature that's going to come by the next summer. And we're also, of course, increasing our capability for mountain glacier for water availability questions. In terms of CESM development itself, what we're actively working on right now is subglacial hydrology, a better model for iceberg calving and subice shelf melting, mountain glaciers again, solid earth, GIA, as I mentioned earlier, to have glacial rebound and ice shelf self-gravity, and some improved ice sheet initialization, which is a big unknown right now and has strong impact on ice sheet simulations. If you want to know more about our effort at NCAR, here are some contact information, the Land Ice Working Group website that you can go to at any time. You can contact me. I'm the co-chair of the Land Ice Working Group and also the liaison of the Land Ice Working Group, but also Kate Calder, who's a software engineer liaison of the Land Ice Working Group, and Bill Lipscomb, who's a main CESM developer. We have a winter meeting in 2024, and hopefully we'll see some of you there. And I'm going to finish with this slide here. If you'd like to learn more about ice sheet processes or physics, you can, of course, there's a couple of books that are good references in the field, or you can play a video game to do just this. This was created and powered by Anne LeBrock, who is a glaciologist at the University of Exeter. And the goal here, as you can see on the right-hand side, is to have the penguins get to the fish and high-five some birds. And you do this by controlling the surface mass balance, but the accumulation and the ocean temperature. So this video games takes you on this adventure and learning more about ice sheet by playing, which is great. I tried it the other day, and you also learn about cool facts. So the Roni ice shelves, I don't know if you know this, but it was named after Jackie Roney, which was the first American woman setting foot on the Antarctic continent and spent 15 months there between 1946 and 1948. So I thought it was pretty cool. So that's it for now. I will end it right there. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you, Gunter. All right, I think we have time for maybe one question here. Is there anybody with a burning question? All right. We have a couple. I just want to make sure that we get to this break on time too. So do you think it'll be a quick question or? All right.
Thank you very much
I'm
for
happy to take
your
questions during the break too.
Okay, thank you. My question mainly related to the coupler, the mechanism used in the coupler to manage the interaction between different components in the model. Could you please give a brief on that?
That's is that a quick question? So the coupler. So I'm not an expert on the coupler. Are you specifically asking between the ice sheet and the land? Or in general?
Yes, that's what he's wondering.
Okay, so so the way it works is that in order to, the ice sheet does not what the ice sheet needs is a surface mass balance. So it's an accumulation in temperature. So the land model computes this field using a surface energy balance scheme, sends this information via the coupler. And this is what it sends it to the coupler and CESM grabs it. And then in return, CESM gives the land, it changes in elevation and also in extent. So what the exchange at the end is like masks. There's no physics happening within the coupler itself. Everything happens in the components. Does this help?
Yes, he says that helps. Thank you. All right, we got one last question and then it's the break.
I know there is a lot
And I'm
of.
happy to talk more about this.
Hi, Gunter. I know there is a lot of uncertainty in the initialization of snow, particularly over the mountainous, high mountainous regions, and also in calculation of surface fluxes. So I was wondering, how does the model perform in terms of biases in the simulation? And because you might have done long simulations, so you can you give some idea on that?
So we did not do long simulation, or if by long you mean 20 years, then yes. But so yeah, the simulation we did, we did have problem with this, and Adam actually did more of the analysis. Adam Harrington did more of the analysis on this. But what the model was suffering when we ran it is that it did not have any information on the direction of the sun, for example. So a grid cell does not know anything about whether a mountain is facing north, east, southwest. And there's a component of the land model that's called the hill slope model that can do this, but we did not run with it. So we hope that we can improve on this in the future by adding this and see if it really helps. But other than that, yes, for initialization of the model, we're trying to to work with ERA 5 data. But yeah, that's all really I can say. We're not doing it, and except that we're not doing a great job in this representation right now.
All right. Thank you so much, Gunter. As he said, he's willing to talk at the break, or you can email him and set up a time directly or something like that. So let's go ahead and do that, and we'll go to our break. If you get snacks, again, I'm going to remind you, like the other days, if you bring them in here, please clean up your trash afterwards. Okay, we'll see you back here at 10:30. Thanks again, Gunter. You're getting applause.
Thanks.
Okay, so welcome back from the break. I'm sorry they're not as long as probably we would hope. We're running a little slower today. A lot of that's my fault from this morning. But our next talk, it's a specialized talk. It's by Adam Harrington on variable resolution CESM. You've seen a lot of images of this over the week, and so now you'll learn a little bit more about what it takes to actually run it. And Adam does a lot with massive model data sets and state-of-the-art climate modeling. So we go to him when we have questions about this sort of stuff.
Hi, thanks, Alice. So I'm a project scientist here. Is this too loud? Okay. I'm a project scientist here at CGD, and I work on variable resolution grids, among other things. When you work here, you quickly get pulled into different directions, and you become a bit of a Renaissance man or woman. So anyways, I'm going to talk about variable resolution. So let's do that. Let's just start off with the basics, the what's, the why's, the how of variable resolution. And so it is just CSM's label for static mesh refinement capabilities in our atmospheric model CAM. You'll hear me refer to it as regional refinement as well. And you'll hear that in the literature, these two terms, variable resolution and regional refinement, being used interchangeably. And so static mesh refinement is just a particular grid refinement approach. And so I figured we should, at a high level, sort of talk about the different ones. So the first one is domain nesting. I'm gonna just make sure to get my clock out here. So domain nesting is basically, it requires two separate models, basically. And you sort of have a high resolution, limited area model that you sort of put in. It occupies a subregion of a coarser, let's say, global model. And this is a very heavy way to do grid refinement. You have to support two separate models. These two separate models have their own separate discretization errors and assumptions, and so you do have to worry about inconsistencies of mending those two solutions together. And so static mesh refinement is a cleaner way to do this type of refinement. It's where we just refine a global grid over a particular region of interest in the same model. So that's what we support in CAM. And so here are just some examples of grids, and I think you've probably seen them over the week, of some static mesh refinement grids. The sort of cool cousin is called adaptive mesh refinement. And so this is where it's the same thing. It's a global model, and you refine a particular region, but it actually, where you're refining on the globe changes in time. And you want to sort of, for example, if a tropical cyclone starts to form in your simulation, you might want to throw more resolution at that as it starts to move around in order to resolve that tropical cyclone. So unfortunately, it's just not practical at this point that there is no sort of operational atmospheric model that uses adaptive mesh refinement. There are experimental versions of atmospheric models that use AMR. But I do want to draw attention to an ice sheet model that uses adaptive mesh refinement. It's called Bicycles, and it was developed by Dan Martin at Lawrence Berkeley Labs. And this is just a picture of Antarctica, and we're going to look at a bird's eye view of, this is the Pine Island Glacier in West Antarctica. And what's shown here is this red line is the grounding line, so maybe Günther had gone over what that means, but it's when the grounded ice sheet sort of lifts off and becomes an ice shelf. So it lifts off the ground due to the buoyancy floating on the ocean. And you want to have higher resolution at that grounding line to be able to resolve that transition. And so that's what Bicycles did. So here's just an example. If I blow it up, okay. Of a visualization of what the mesh looks like in a retreat scenario in West Greenland and West Antarctica, and you can see the black is the higher resolution boxes that are following a retreating grounding line. So it's quite cool. But let's look at a prognostic field and see what this really looks like. And yeah, it's really exciting retreat of the West Antarctic ice sheet. This is happening over hundreds of years, and it's more or less gone at the end of the simulation. So we use static mesh refinement. We don't use that. But moving on to why we want to do this, the appeal is that you can simulate high resolution in a global model at an actual affordable cost. If you wanted to run global high resolution sub-kilometer grids for centuries, you're out of luck. That's just not possible right now. And so it sounds like hyperbole, and I've heard it from other talks, but it basically makes the impossible possible, okay, through these trade-offs of refining a particular region. And in terms of the cost savings that you might get, this is just a wall clock time on the y-axis of eight ensemble members in the blue of a global quarter-degree run, and then the equivalent quarter-degree refined mesh in the pink here. And you can see that the refined grid is about 5 times cheaper than the global quarter-degree model. We redid this calculation more recently, and then the y-axis here is the core hours per simulated year, so this is your model cost. And the global quarter-degree model is about 100,000 core hours per simulated year. Our Arctic quarter-degree grid is 20,000, so about a fifth of that. So those numbers still check out 10 years later. And so, CAM is the vehicle that supports variable resolution in CSM. CAM supports multiple dynamical cores. Hopefully, Peter had discussed that with you guys on Monday. And 2 dynamical cores support variable resolution gridding technologies. And that is the MPAS-A dynamical core. So that was developed at the MCube lab down the hill. But it wasn't until very recently, within the last year or two, that we actually have ported it into CSM 2.3. And so you guys could conceivably check out CSM 2.3 and run MPAS right now. Its mesh is based on centroidal Voronoi, fancy word for hexagons arranged in a particular way such that there's no overlaps or underlaps on the grid. And you can define sort of a density field and come up with a variable resolution grid using these Voronoi meshes with very smooth transitions from the coarse region to the fine region. The other die core is the spectral element dynamical core. This was jointly developed by NCAR and DOE. We have been supporting a hydrostatic version of this in CSM 2.0 or later. It is based on a cube sphere mesh. As a reminder, a cube sphere mesh is you have a cube, it has 6 sides, you blow it up to the shape of a volleyball, okay, and that's what's depicted here. And then each of those 6 sides of the cube, we cut up into quadrilateral elements that are given in the blue lines here. But this is a finite element method, so within each element, you actually have a structure of the solution. And so you have resolution within that element, which is depicted here, and there's a continuous basis set representation of the solution in here using high-order polynomials. But we evaluate them at these quadrature nodes. So these are grid points. And so for each element, there's 9 independent grid points. And so I developed, for my postdoc, I decided to try to increase the reach of people to use variable resolution grids. And we had made sure that there were 3 grids that you could run out of the box in CSM 2.2. And this is just showing the element grid for those 3 grids. We have the Arctic grid, the Arctic grist grid, and the CONUS grid. CONUS grid has been around for a while. I developed these Arctic grids. And if you want to run them in an AMIP configuration, you can do that. You can just look at the CAM63 user's guide for instructions on that. So what is involved with running variable resolution that's different than running the old-fashioned workhorse resolution model? So the things that we sort of needed to automate so that you can run these out of the box are the things that are important to change when you increase the horizontal resolution in a model. The number one thing you need to do is you need to reduce the strength of your numerical filters so we can support a less diffusive solution at higher resolution. And so to achieve this, we have scale-aware tensor hyperviscosity operators that effectively adjust the damping coefficient according to the local element dimensions on the grid. You also need to reduce your time steps. You're running at higher resolution. The dynamical core uses explicit time stepping, and so you need to satisfy your CFL criterion by lowering your time step for stability purposes. You also want to reduce your physics time step in tandem. That's primarily for physical realism. I had a figure that I decided was too much information that goes into why you need to do this for the physics time step. But maybe we have time at the end to go over that. A really important one is you want to increase the resolution of your boundary conditions. Okay, and topography is very important to take advantage of the higher resolution you're being afforded. The thing with topography is in order to prepare topography for use in a GCM, you have to smooth out that topography. In effect, you have to remove all of the 2dx length scales from that topography. And so at higher resolution, 2dx is a smaller length scale, and so you can support a rougher terrain at high resolution. And this is an example of what the Himalayan front range looks like in our global 1 degree model, a global quarter degree model, and this is our 7-kilometer high Mountain Asia grid that I think Gunter alluded to in the last talk, and you can start to see we're starting to resolve peaks and valleys that look like reality, as indicated by the GMTED data set that we used actually to generate all these topography fields. You also, in addition to your topography, your land surface type for the land model, okay, you want to increase the resolution of those. That will allow you to resolve sort of complex coastlines, whether that's lake or near the ocean. Ice sheet margins at 1 degree are actually subgrid, and that's where a lot of your ablation occurs, and so you want to take advantage of that at higher resolution. And mountain glaciers, of course, but mountain glaciers are a kilometer wide, so they're going to be subgrid features until you're running kilometer scale grid spacing. Emissions data sets is important for people interested in air quality and pollution. If you think about pollution, they tend to be point sources over urban centers, okay? And in a 1 degree model, your grid box is not the size of a city, it's the size of a state, okay? And so it makes it look like your entire state is emitting when really it's only coming from the urban portions. And so it's important to take advantage of that at higher resolution and to have a high resolution emissions data set. So you guys can run VR CSM2. However, you'll quickly run into problems if you don't know how to regrid model output. This model output is going to come out on an unstructured grid, and there's really no way around it to do your typical atmospheric analyses without eventually having to regrid it to a latitude-longitude grid for some purposes. And so this is part 2, is to emphasize we need to learn how to regrid. You have to eat your spinach. It's not fun, but once you ascend that learning curve, you can do it with your eyes closed. And this is the problem, is that we have, our atmospheric science community is used to thinking of things in terms of a 2D structured coordinate, latitude and longitude. And so a lot of 90s models A lot of the models up until recently were operationally based on this latitude-longitude grid, and to some extent we sort of took that for granted, that our model is using the same coordinate as the coordinate we use in our atmospheric dynamics class when we have to derive the equations of motion, et cetera. And so you're used to getting here's a surface pressure array in time, and you have the latitude and your longitude dimensions. It's structured, you know, dot, 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 dot. Here's where I am on the sphere. An unstructured grid completely flattens your horizontal dimension to one dimension. And so it's just your surface pressure array is just time and ncal. And it's just an unstructured coordinate. If you're at index 1 of ncal at some point here on the grid, index 2, you have no idea where that next grid column is. It could be to the left of you, it could be to the right to you, it could be above you, it could be on the other side of the globe. It doesn't matter, it's unstructured. And so you lose that sort of ability to know where you are and to anticipate what things are next to you. But the appeal of this is it allows us for very flexible grid structures and allows us to do things like variable resolution. So that's the trade-off. Now, in terms of making map plots, NCL, Python, you can feed in these unstructured arrays, and it will plot a map plot for you. Okay, and so you don't need to regrid in order to do a map plot. However, if you wanted to do a zonal mean, it's just all of a sudden it's hard. In lat long coordinates, you just average over the longitude dimension. Zonal mean, how would you do that in an unstructured grid? And so you need to remap to a lat long grid. Stream function, same thing. You need to evaluate gradients in the lat and the long direction. And so in these unstructured grids, you're going to have to remap to a lat long to perform that operation. So I have come up with 3 steps for how to properly regrid. What is an improper regridding? So you may have MATLAB or whatever, and it may have a bilinear interpolation function. And you may say, hey, I want to use this to turn my unstructured array into a lat long grid array. And so with that, you could do that, but you have no idea what your interpolation errors are. And so it's better to use software that has very well-vetted algorithms to do the regridding. And so, again, step 1, you have to define what you want to regrid to. This is your destination grid. It needs to be sort of equal resolution or coarser than the source grid, okay, that you're operating with. So you don't necessarily want to ever really map to higher resolution without thinking carefully about what you're doing. Step 2 is you generate mapping weights files. This is where the magic's done. This is done using command line ESMF. That's the one that I recommend. The libraries are installed on Cheyenne, and you just need to run this executable pointing to a source grid file and a destination grid file if you're choosing. And the third step is that you are is just regrid an array using this mapping weights file on the fly. Anytime you're in NCL and in Python, you get an array, you want to convert it to lat long. It's just a one-step process. After you've loaded the library that can read in these mapping weights files, you just apply them. So just one line. Okay, I only have a few minutes, and so I just want to go over just an interesting result from variable resolution, because I haven't done that for you yet. And so I just want to go over how we've been improving the Greenland surface mass balance using variable resolution. Greenland, in sort of these 1 degree and 2 degree models over here, and on the x-axis is the number of grid points representing Greenland. And these 1 degree and 2 degree models is maybe a couple hundred grid cells. But when we go to variable resolution, we're talking about thousands of grid cells. And that does have a substantial impact on the solution. This is the integrated precipitation over Greenland for 1 to 2 degree models. And the means are over here, and you can see that they systematically overestimate the precipitation. That's what Gunter was showing with the SMB biases in Southeast Greenland. And then the variable resolutions in the magenta and the purple are much more similar to our target, which is RACMO here. Similar story for melting but not quite as severe. So why are we overproducing precipitation in these coarser grids? And so if you look at the biases in the incident shortwave during the summer, and so these are the model ones with respect to Sirius EBAF, you get these red hotspots around the oceans off the coast of Greenland. And so there are supposed to be clouds there, and they're not there. In the interior, you see a lot more blues, and so there's too much cloud in the interior than there should be. And then at quarter degree and eighth degree, those biases effectively go away. But these map onto the precipitation biases, which are given below, where you have sort of anomalous precipitation over the southern dome, southeast Greenland, in the 1 degree and 2 degree models, but once you go to quarter degree and eighth degree, they go away. And the reason for this has to do with our boundary conditions. And so the topography in the 1 to 2 degree models is too smooth, and it results in like a flat ice sheet. And so these are the 1 to 2 degree boundary conditions, and this is quarter degree and eighth degree, and then some reference. Down here's the difference. And so you see it's flattened and widened, the ice sheets at 1 degree and 2 degrees. And so what happens is these storms that come off, hit Greenland coast, they're not aggressively lifted because the topography is too smooth and the moisture penetrates far inland and dumps on the interior. In contrast, these quarter degree and eighth degree models, they can aggressively lift these systems and trap the moisture at the margins. Some falls over the ocean, some falls over the margin, and you get rid of that bias. So, you know, that you trace back to making sure that you increase the resolution of your boundary conditions. So I think that's it. If I have time, I have another slide about coupling this to the ocean, but let's stop and take questions, I guess.
All right. Thank you, Adam. We have time for a few questions.
Hi, thank you for your excellent presentation. So I have two questions. First one is, so we have different regridding methods like bilinear, bicubic, nearest neighbor. So the question is, do you have any specific algorithm or specific way that you'd follow for the regridding? And the second question is like XESMF, it is kind of difficult to install sometimes because it has a dependency. You need to have ESM and a lot of other things. So workaround is like you have CDO. So do you think instead of using XESMF, if someone uses CDO, would they run into any technical problems?
I don't have experience using CDO for regridding, but if it, so I don't see a problem with it.
They also calculate the weights.
And so NCO also does something similar, but NCO actually has 3 algorithms. It has its own internal NCO one. So I'm going to speak about NCO because I don't know about CDO. But it also has Tempest Remap and ESMF as its other options. So you can run those 2 regridding algorithms that I put on here through NCO, but I'm not advocating for that because we don't need a middleman. But to your first question, ESMF has a conservative bilinear. It has a high order conservative that's new. It has this patch one, nearest neighbor. I like conservative first order for ESMF. Like I said, I'm usually coarse gridding. I'm not ever upscaling because I do not want to make up scales. If you were to do that, you would want to use a high order regridding mapping algorithm. Tempest Remap orders has a larger selection of high order methods than just ESMF's conservative second order. That's the only high order method.
Sorry if you mentioned, well, thank you for the talk. This is very helpful. I don't know if you mentioned this in a different way, but are the domains one-way or two-way coupling for the variable resolution?
Yeah, they're two-way naturally because it's the same model and just the grid is getting refined. So it's the same model, so there's naturally two-way coupling. For nested domains where you're putting one model into another model, there are options on whether or not you have that high resolution feeding back into the coarser region or not. Or you could do sort of just one way where the coarser host model sort of just drives the high resolution. So for domain nesting, you can think about that, but for static and AMR, it's built into the method.
I guess one clarification on that is that most of what you've talked about is with the F comp set of the model, which is the atmosphere only. So it's not always fully coupled with the rest of the system, just to be clear.
Okay, thank you very much for this great presentation. My question mainly related to the. Is this a different version from CESM because it is VR CSM? Because I think the CSM I think it mainly has the capability to deal with different resolution. So why there is another version?
Yeah, so it's the same version of the model, so it's not a different version. It's just what I'm labeling it when you invoked those grids in CSM. So it's just a label. An analogy to what you're asking about is we have RCSM, which is regional CSM. That's a branch of CSM that's not really supported. It's not on the official CSM code base. And in that one, they actually do domain nesting of WRF with CSM. And at some point, we figured that this isn't something that we want to support officially. So that's in contrast to variable resolution, where we officially support it in CSM.
Okay, thank you.
It takes a lot of resources to support the model, just so you know. All right.
Hello, thank you, Adam. Not a question, but just a comment. I tried to use CDO as well for the regrade the output for spectral element data, and CDO asks for the reference points. So, but spectral element has unstructured grid. So at first, with the ESMF tools, we need to define some reference points or some something like that. So CDO is a way to use like remapping or regrading processes, but not for unstructured data, but graded data. Yeah. Thank you, Adam.
Okay, it's very nice talk. I have a question about the structure and unstructured grid. So I think for the conventional CAM, they use like arrow-C grid for because it's rectangular with 4 sides. But when you change to unstructured, it's no longer like rectangular, and they have like 6 sides. I think. Are you still using the arrow-C grid, or like you need some modification?
For the, it's analogous in that. The winds are centered at the faces. So you have the winds in 6 different directions on the faces. And then the thermodynamics and the scalar variables would be at the center for MPAS. So it's analogous to a C-grid, how it's face-centered winds.
All right, final question up there.
Yeah, thanks for the talk. Just a quick question. Do you know if people are also trying to invent variable resolution in the ocean component of CESM?
You know, I can't speak to that. I really can't speak to that. What Gunter had showed about high resolution under ice shelf cavities makes me hesitant to say no, because there seems to be some ability to have a higher resolution in regions. And so I can't speak to whether MOM supports variable resolution.
I think that MOM can do regional configurations, but they're not doing regionally refined within CESM as far as I am aware.
Thanks.
All right, if you have other questions, if they're burning right this moment, you can try to talk to Adam outside, and then otherwise we're gonna go ahead and move on. Oh, one other thing with your name tags, if you're done with them before you leave, if you could leave them at that front table, they'll be able to be reused in the future. All right. And then you want to turn it so it's green down there. Okay. Super loud. They'll adjust it up there. Good. Okay.
Okay.
So next we have Monica. She's a philosopher of science, and she has studied CESM and other models and how they are developed from a philosophy perspective. And she's here to talk more about climate justice.
Okay, thank you. And yeah, hopefully sound is okay. I'm kind of a loud person, so sorry if I get a little bit excited. But yeah, so as Alice said, Monica Einhorn-Morrison, I'm a specialist here in the Climate and Global Dynamics Lab, specifically the Terrestrial Sciences section right now. And I wear a lot of different hats. One of the hats that I wear is actually as one of the co-leads on the new CESM task force focused on climate justice, which if any of you are interested, I do actually have a sheet, because I might forget to say this at the end, where you're welcome to put down your name to be added to our listserv to get information about future activities, about the intersection of kind of ethics more generally as it's related to climate science, and what's going on in CESM. But today what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview of what climate justice is. Sorry. And then talk about the intersections between climate science and justice concerns, and actually give a couple of really interesting examples of how people have been utilizing models to help provide answers to questions that crop up when we're thinking about justice within the context of climate change. And so, quick outline of my talk, I'm just going to talk about what the types of justice are. Kind of, in ethics, we like to, parse up the space into a lot of different like subcategories and stuff. So I'll give you an overview of what that looks like, and then talk about that when applied to actually thinking about climate change. And so this is kind of like thoroughly ethics, not really getting into the science realm, but then I'll talk about how justice concerns actually come up when we think about climate science itself. Then we'll look at, as I said, the way in which models can be used to kind of help us to answer some of these justice questions that come up in the context of climate change, and then just some additional considerations related to that task team that I said that we started to develop within CESM. Okay, so justice most generally, when we talk about it, concerns equity and equality. Okay, but we divide up the space in terms of, well, 4 types of justice, although there's controversies about which of the 2 at the bottom we actually want to adopt. But first and foremost, we have what's known as distributive justice, which is one of the main kind of types of justice that comes up when we're thinking about, for example, climate impacts and the costs and benefits, and the way that they're distributed with respect to mitigation and adaptation policies. But distributive justice is just kind of most generally, that everybody, right, gets a fair share and access to benefits and resources. And so one of the ways to think about this in the context of climate change most generally is that there's kind of like a global commons of resources, including a carbon sink, right? And the idea that has led to a lot of discussion of justice, or that started out the discussions of justice when we're thinking about climate change, is how everybody's not really getting a fair share of that carbon sink. Some countries are utilizing more of it than others, and some of them are utilizing it a lot less. And so what does that mean for the type of constraints or things that we need to do when we're putting in place mitigation policies? Who needs to mitigate faster because they've already taken up a lot of their sink? Who maybe has a little bit more time to enact policies and gets a little bit more wiggle room because they haven't used up that global commons? Procedural justice has to do with the creation and implementation of decisions, where that process of decision making and the outcomes are things that are actually consistent with fair, neutral, and impartial procedures. And one of the most important things when it comes to procedural justice that you see again in the context of thinking about climate change and climate change discussions is that it's necessary to include those individuals or communities who are most impacted by not only the process and the decisions that are made, but also the possible consequences and outcomes. And so, for example, when we think about the various agreements that they come and they do at the Conference of the Parties, like the nationally determined contributions for mitigating and adaptation and stuff, this is where procedural justice maybe has not been enacted in the most ideal way, but where procedural justice concerns would absolutely come up. Then there's what's known as retributive justice, which is where there's essentially reciprocal treatment. So if you harm me, I get to harm you back in some kind of equal manner. So there's that kind of like classic idea of like an eye for an eye. This is essentially what retributive justice is. And there's a lot of concerns for that because it doesn't actually allow for the manifestation of benefits or healing on the part of the individuals that are harmed. So there's a lot of push when we're considering ethics and discussion amongst people who work on the concept of justice to actually have an alternative known as restorative justice, where the focus is not on kind of, doing harm to those who've done harm to others, but is actually focused on repairing the harms done with an eye or consideration towards promoting the most amount of healing and recovery from those harms by the people that were harmed. So when it comes to justice in climate change, we get kind of three main concerns for justice, most having to deal with distributive justice. But when I talk about kind of what's going on when we think about the scientific landscape or scientific environment, you also see that there's some other varieties of justice that crop up. But one concern is the uneven exposure to climate impacts across countries and communities within countries. Certain people might have certain advantages, while as others might be disadvantaged within a country. This is true of also across the nations. And so they might be more vulnerable and more harmed from various climate impacts like severe weather events than other people within that nation who are in other communities or just even other nations in general. Communities and those that are already, unfortunately, socially, politically, and economically disadvantaged, who happen to also be the least responsible for the problem and crisis we currently find ourselves in, actually are going to get kind of the brunt of the damage and harm coming to them. So we can see this with respect to kind of all the extreme events that are happening. If you think to large and small island nations, if you think to areas where desertification is leading to extreme water scarcity and agricultural problems along kind of that like tropical belt. Those are countries that are the least responsible for the greenhouse gas emissions that have led to where we currently find ourselves, yet they are the ones that are experiencing the most impacts now, and that's only going to unfortunately increase in the future. And then lastly, in thinking about policies, as I said, benefits and costs associated with the development and implementation of policies. These actually currently are, and unfortunately probably will continue in the future, to be unevenly distributed across sectors and communities. And this can actually compound already existing inequalities because, as you'll see in some of the examples I have, communities that already might be economically disadvantaged kind of unfortunately are the ones who have to take the trickle-down effects of mitigation policies that are carbon taxes as an example. Okay, so just a couple of quick examples of these three dimensions or these three kind of things that are going on at the intersection of justice and climate change. Unequal exposure, heat waves and the distribution of heat across urban communities is actually a good example of this. There's increased vulnerability and actually explicitly documented harms and fatalities amongst those who are low income, elderly, and in communities of Black, Indigenous, and peoples of color. So an example of this would be the 1995 heat wave that came through Chicago, where upwards of 98% of the fatalities due to that heat wave, which was extreme for the time, 78% were actually people from these categories. So there's also interesting gendered vulnerabilities or disproportion of impacts felt across genders. An example of this is that the impacts of drought and desertification, women that are living in rural areas in Global South are largely responsible for kind of all things related to keeping up the household, and they do a lot of outside activities, including collecting water. And as we see an increase in things like drought and desertification and water scarcity. They're going to be the ones that are most impacted by this and the most vulnerable also to those kind of extreme weather conditions. And then sea level rise is another one, where small and large island nations are actually facing disproportionate rise rates. An example of this, actually, they used a model to look at what that disproportionality is across large and small island nations against coastal areas from like Antarctic ice sheet melt. And they found that in some cases, there's 30% more rise expected because of their spatial locations and kind of that like spatial fingerprint of sea level rise that's often not talked about when it comes to global impacts. Unequal burden. Here, water and food scarcity. Extreme weather is a huge driver of water and food scarcity, especially in areas where they're already experiencing desertification and they don't have this kind of state-of-the-art infrastructure to be able to take water to irrigate fields, which can have huge problems for agriculture, can have huge problems for grazing, cattle, things like that. And this unequal burden of kind of a lot of these impacts are going to be felt, like I said, around that tropical belt, where these are not the people that are necessarily responsible for the majority of the carbon emissions, and yet they're going to be the ones that are experiencing the water and food security, and they already are experiencing other disadvantages. Energy transition disruptions, this is an interesting one that if you follow anything that's going on with COP discussions, actually probably not contemporary COP discussions, but ones about a decade ago, they were talking about placing like significant taxes and not even allowing various countries that are making that move to have kind of a more well-developed energy infrastructure, not allowing them to rely on fossil fuels. Yet they don't really have kind of the economic stability and the infrastructure to adopt green technologies. And so they're kind of just like, you know, unfortunately SOL. And that's really unfair, right? Because they should be able to develop along the same course that the currently global north nations that have these really complex, sophisticated energy infrastructures have, and yet they're being told that they can't use coal, that they can't use all of these things that like North America, right, and the Europeans have used in order to develop their nations. Climate migration, this one's actually really scary. It's already happening too. But there was a recent study that came out that figured that by 2050, it's estimated that climate migration from Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Southeast Asia will grow to 143 million migrating from their homelands because of things like water and food scarcity, extreme events, extreme weather events, including heat waves, flooding, things like that. I mean, we already saw that, right? The Pakistan floods that happened last year. We saw a lot of heat waves. We see a lot of desertification already happening in Sub-Saharan Africa that's leading people to seek out new places because their livelihoods are being destroyed by the impacts of climate change. And then I've divided climate migration and forcible dislocation, which is another uneven burden, because forcible dislocation, it's that their lands won't even exist anymore. So they don't have the choice whether to migrate or not. And this is a lot of the small island nations that we have in the Pacific and the oceanic areas that sit very, very, very low, like a meter above sea level in some places, and we've already projected that there will be at least a meter of sea level rise that unfortunately will just lead to the non-existence, if you will, of their lands, their cultures, and their communities. There we go, unequal distribution, because you need more unfairness, right? So reliance on fossil fuels tends to be higher, interestingly enough, and we see this a lot in the United States and certain places in Europe, but among low-income communities. And this is because, right, they don't have what they need in order to, like, you know, make their windows really tight so that heat that they're using to heat their houses doesn't escape, things like that. And mitigation policies for example, such as carbon taxes, the effect actually trickles down, such that they just increase the cost of energy, and a lot of individuals can, in high income, middle income places, can transition away once fossil fuel energy gets too expensive. That's not an opportunity that a lot of these low income places have, and their energy ends up going up, and they actually experience more costs and burdens due to some of these mitigation policies. There are attempts to put in place subsidies so that the tax doesn't trickle down, but that's kind of a slow going augmentation to bring justice back into the picture with a lot of these taxes. Coal mining reclamation, there's some interesting examples of what's happened in like Pennsylvania and stuff here, where they agree, to dismantle a mine, and then they find these legal loopholes whereby the coal companies can actually just kind of leave and abandon the mine and claim bankruptcy. And the consequence of that is that you have this like mine that's abandoned in a community that probably is already experiencing, unfortunately, social and economical disadvantages. They have increased pollution in the area that they can't do much about. And this also, claiming bankruptcy, allows coal companies to forego on their obligations to their workers, like paying out pensions and stuff. So a lot of workers end up also feeling the downstream trickle-down effects of these mitigation policies. Electric vehicle subsidies, a lot of the benefits of owning an electric vehicle in terms of like tax breaks and things like that. Well, who are the people that can afford the electric vehicles to begin with? You don't have access to charging stations. It's probably people that are middle and upper class in the global north. Two other examples, there's the Great Wall of Lagos. So this is an example from 2019. And so these are all mitigation, these three up here. These are adaptation policies down here. So it happens across both. But with respect to adaptation policies, they actually built a wall and they used tons and tons of concrete that ended up protecting a luxury location from inundation and the effects of like sea level rise and extreme weather events. And what they did in the course of implementing that seawall is they actually redirected seawater to economically disadvantaged areas. So serious disproportionate impacts of an adaptation policy there, a lot of injustice. And then national insurance rates. Those are based on risk. High-risk areas tend to be those where there are disadvantaged economically, politically, and socially disadvantaged communities. That's where they're built. They have higher risk. They have to pay higher insurance rates. In some cases now, they're not even able to get insurance. And so these are kind of some of the unequal distribution of those costs and whatnot from policies. Now, turning to the science quickly, we can think about within climate science itself, if there's any cases of or any justice issues. And there's a couple that have been talked about. This third one is actually what I work on. And it's an interesting type of injustice that's not been talked a lot about, called knowledge injustice. But before we get to that, there's distributive injustice. And so there was a paper that came out, Overland et al. 2021. I have the reference if anybody's interested. But they looked at the distribution of funding for research on climate change and Africa. And they found that globally, only 3% of funding goes to looking at climate impacts or climate change questions that focus on Africa as a region. And then 78% of that 3.8% of global funding actually goes to global north institutions to answer those questions. So distribution of funding, there's a lot of inequality there. And if we look at other various regions, especially across the global south, there's not a lot of scientific questions that are being asked about the impacts. There's not a lot of attribution and detection studies being done about the extreme events, which is a huge problem, as I'll show, because those detection and attribution studies specifically can actually help us to understand loss and damages due to climate change, which is a big thing in terms of reparative justice that'll be talked about in COP28. procedural justice, injustice, actually. Decisions on metrics, the significance of various metrics for understanding targets that inform policies, decisions about research priorities, experimental designs for kind of global multi-model simulations, things like that. There's a lot of lack of representation of certain perspectives and communities and how those are being set. And then knowledge injustice, there's actually just exclusion and marginalization in the development of the knowledge that is considered to be the kind of like global commons of or global understanding of climate change of a lot of community standpoints and groups. And so this is essentially what's known as inequality in knowledge generations and inequality in terms of the perspectives that are represented in the resulting knowledge products. Okay, so quickly, because I think I'm probably running a little bit over, sorry. How can science help us to understand justice in the context of climate change? Even though science itself has some justice issues to tackle, there's actually some really interesting work that's being done, specifically with models, to kind of figure out these various dimensions of justice when we're thinking about especially climate impacts. So I'm going to give you 3 quick examples. There's a really interesting study that came out in 2022 where they investigate the implications of specifically the global mean temperature target that is often used to shape policies and is the one that's discussed as kind of what we want from the IPCC and COP. And so they can investigate whether or not there's any kind of distributive injustice of the impacts under those global metrics, whether those are metrics for mitigation, innovation, or even adaptation, right? Another really interesting study that's actually 2023 is we can use models to help us define the boundaries between what is just and what is unjust. By thinking about different thresholds for harm that are just or unjust. And then models can give us an idea of kind of, well, what does the world need to look like so that we don't push past that threshold? And then another one that I've already mentioned is the detection and attribution studies, where we can actually quantify loss and damage due to climate change and possibly in the future hold the countries that are largely responsible for repairing those damages and losses. Okay, so first one, what they essentially were looking at is relying on the temperature target, right? So global mean temperature, 1.52 degree, let's stay under that, right? All that jazz. Is that inadequate for actually characterizing other climate risks, especially risks where we might get some sort of unequal impacts to certain communities there? And there was actually the ability to demonstrate that even with slowed warming, so they use RCP 4.6. I hope I'm getting the number right. No, I'm not getting the number right. There's a scenario person in the back who's shaking his head. Okay, one of we decrease, right, and go to net zero rather quickly, mid-century, right? So low to middle emissions pathway type thing, which is maybe, if we're thinking of our current state, ideally what we're on, right? They showed that even with under that type of scenario, that there's long-term sea level rise that's going to be unjust. Because there's distributive injustice concerning the spatio and temporal distribution of sea level rise, specifically for small island nations. And this is where that number of that disproportionate impact of them experiencing 30% more sea level rise, right, comes from, is actually this study. And what they did is they used CESM to investigate the distribution of sea level rise from Antarctic ice sheet melt under a couple of different scenarios and demonstrated that there's an uneven spatial fingerprint from the Antarctic ice sheet's contribution to sea level rise, where the burden is felt both there's small and large island nations. And this again is even under slowed warming projections. And so basically the conclusion of this is that global mean temperature is not consistent, interestingly enough, with the UNFCCC goal 2 for climate, which is to avoid dangerous anthropogenic interference in the climate system, because even underneath that 1.5, 2 degree, within that kind of margin for temperature increase, in the long term by 2030, some of these small and large island nations won't exist anymore. Constraining of the Earth system boundaries. This one is really cool. So it like just got published a couple months ago. The author list is just like so many people, really, really diverse. They looked at a ton of different things. They didn't use CESM. They used another set. I think they used the UK ESM. But this is how you can use Earth system models. But what they did is they started by constructing this definition of justice, where they said, okay, justice essentially comes about through the avoidance of significant harms. And then they said significant harms in terms of the categories of things that need to avoid them in order for the Earth system to function would be non-human species and ecosystems, right? Certain Earth system stabilities, future generations, and then current generations, okay? So they took that definition of significant harm, and then they ran a model under a couple of different scenarios, and then they were able to use the model and the model runs, and then the impacts assessments from the model runs to actually quantify what that boundary is for safe and just Earth system. And they looked exclusively sometimes at like what it would take in order to reach a certain tipping point that would cause significant harm to like various parts of the Earth system, like the biosphere, like nutrient cycles, things like that. They essentially looked at climate, biosphere, water, nutrients, aerosol pollution, additional sources of pollutants. And the interesting thing, since we're talking about climate here, is that the climate model studies demonstrated that in order to stay within the boundaries of a just and safe Earth system, we need to hit a temperature target of, I say around 1 degree. It's actually a little bit lower than 1 degree. But this is for a just boundary for avoiding any kind of significant harm to non-human species, Earth system stability, future generations, current generations. And it's more strict than what would be considered safe, where we do allow for certain harms. Okay, last one, quickly, attribution for loss and damage. Werner, who is at PNNL, so one of the DOE labs, and a colleague of his, Samson, took these previously done detection attribution studies, extracted the statements where they looked at the attribution from anthropogenic climate change to the increase in precipitation during Hurricane Harvey, which caused a lot of damage. It was something like $20 billion in damage in terms of like the economic like quantification. But they did that and they translated the statements to statements about flooding and associated damages from the increased precipitation. So they were essentially making this move to take event attribution studies and translate them into impact attribution studies, and then try to associate the impacts that were caused by anthropogenic climate change above the impacts that would have been caused in a non-climate change world, right? And they found that in terms of the economic cost of the event and its impacts in terms of loss and damage from the flooding because of the increased precipitation that came from the anthropogenic influence, $13 billion. That's a lot. So pretty interesting the way that people are translating event attribution and detection studies into actually starting to look at impacts and loss and damage from climate impacts. But one thing that I do want to point out is that a lot of these event attribution studies are still largely and disproportionately focused on the global north. And so within the science itself, in terms of the research questions we're asking, that's a problem for distributive justice. Okay, what about modeling? This is what the CESM task force is currently concerned with, is, well, look, there's some degree of procedural inequality in terms of kind of when we look at climate modeling as maybe like a global practice. And decisions about model development, configuration, experimental design, how we apply our models, what questions we think they need to have skill to answer, the accessibility of the models, those can either be consistent with or inconsistent with concerns for justice. Presumably, we want all of those things to be consistent with justice, right? Principles for justice. So we need to do a little bit more work in our model community. There's a need for increased transparency around how decisions are made to begin with, much greater inclusivity and access to those activities where these decisions are being made. We need greater diversification of our instruments, right? We need instruments that can do a really good job at answering questions about other regions that have been kind of marginalized in terms of research questions and demonstrations of skill. In terms of inclusivity and setting of priorities and determining applications, and we also need greater transparency and inclusivity in the development of data products and the translation of those data products in order to increase justice in climate modeling. And so that's what we're doing, or at least trying to do. We're starting to have a conversation about it, which I take to be a really good move. And if you're interested in also being a part of that conversation, shoot me an email or come put your name down on the sheet. Okay, and then here's the references. If you want them, I will send you the PDFs. They're all really interesting papers. They came out in like the last couple of years because, you know, paradigm shifts are kind of slow moving.
All right. Thank you so much, Monica. We have time for a couple questions, and I believe that it's okay. You're available after this for lunch if people wanted to continue the conversation as well.
Yeah, and sorry, I always talk too much.
Okay. I want to see a raise of hands for questions here. Okay.
Hi, Monica. Thank you so much for your talk. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to the role of, I guess, diverse ways of knowing, and I'm particularly thinking of incorporating Indigenous knowledge into these kind of projects, especially in the context of like global modeling.
Yeah, so actually, there's an interesting project that recently got funded here where they could actually speak to how they're trying to do that, because most of my understanding of that is still a little bit theoretical, right? But from a philosophical perspective, right, each one of us kind of occupies a standpoint, right? We have certain experiences in the world, even in our science that orients us towards asking certain questions, right? And so we're always learning and knowing within a perspective, right? And it's never going to be perfectly objective. So the more perspectives we have that we can actually kind of combine together, the better our knowledge will be, right? The more actual objectivity that we'll happen to have there. And global modeling, I mean, one of the things where I think Indigenous ways of knowing can be really helpful is that Western science has traditionally kind of really compartmentalized processes and interactions where they like to do this like thing where they isolate things out and understand them as independent from the rest of a system or environment. Well, Indigenous ways of knowing, it's all about the relations. It's all about the interactivity. And so that's almost an entirely different like set of concepts and way to frame the questions that you ask about the world and how you understand the world. And when it comes to climate, right, especially climate, human system, like biosphere, all those interactions, that's a complex system where there's tons of relations. And Western science might miss out on some of those. And so Indigenous ways of knowing can help us pick up on some of those really important relations, especially for impacts. But they also tend to have really localized knowledge, right? And narratives that can help us to understand what things were like, that can help us to do better at having information to see whether our models are getting some of those small scale things correct. And so I think there's a lot of potential. It just really needs to be done respectively and not no sort of like extractive thing. It needs to be genuine, like bilateral integration. And I think that's the most important thing about joining perspectives together.
So I think the project you're talking about is Rising Voices Changing Coastlines, which I am also a part of. So
Yes.
if you have questions about
There you
that and
go.
how working with Indigenous communities at least in this project, is going. I'll come down to the cafeteria at lunch today. I have to run my stuffed animals back up and stuff like that. I think we have time for one more question, and then Monica is also available at lunch.
And by email too, right? Like, yeah, oh, good, I put it on the slide. Okay, it's like, is it only my name?
Okay, so I don't want to be into the political debate, which country or which government should do what, because we've been doing that for almost 3 decades. We have a lot of COPs, a lot of commitments, and we have forgotten all of that. So instead of wasting everyone's time, I would like to get back to the science.
Okay.
So I come from Bangladesh, so it's one of the most vulnerable countries for tropical cyclones.
Mm-hmm.
And sadly, most of the research and developments on tropical cyclones is actually going in the Western countries where we don't have any participation. And if you want to make a coupled model simulation, you need 1,000 core hours.
Yep.
And for a country where we don't have any supercomputers, it's like out of the table. So as a organization at the forefront of science and development, do you think, or your colleagues at NCAR, do they feel the need that they need to actually put their scientists and researchers from Bangladesh to be mainstreamed? Because if they don't, there will be tropical cyclones, and there will be people, hundreds of thousands of people, dying in a single event. Thank you.
Yeah, excellent question. And I wish we could move more quickly on this type of stuff. But short answer is yes. And we're actually trying to do that because one of the things that we are starting to do in CGD is that some of the scientists are using, for example, the variable resolution, like coupled system, to co-design simulations with a lot of these regions that don't necessarily have the computing capabilities to run a high resolution model to investigate phenomena like tropical cyclones and impacts. And so we currently have what's known as these like affinity groups where we get together, we talk about kind of what are the needs, like can we co-design a simulation, that type of thing. We don't have one for Bangladesh, but shoot me an email and let's talk about it. Because we'd really like to get as many possible going. We currently have one that has been really successful for South America, called the South America Affinity Group, that a couple of people in CGD are working on, but it's largely actually out of RAL, that one is, the Research Applications Lab. But we just started one with Julio Bachmeister, who I think gave a talk. No, Julio? Rich Neal, maybe? Rich, okay, so you're familiar with one of the guys. And Rich is actually part of SAG as well, the South America Affinity Group. But we currently have one for Central, Mesoamerica, and the Caribbean. And I mean, we're trying to test out the adequacy and the fidelity of this variable resolution like capabilities across a lot of regions. And so doing that with a couple of regions now, but there's always a possibility, I think, of expanding and looking into the possibility of co-designing more sorts of simulations with regions that are very much underserved by the science.
All right. Thank you so much, Monica. Anyone else who has questions, Monica will be available at lunch. So yeah, I think you can continue this really fruitful discussion.
Thanks. Sorry I went over. All right. Yeah, and names, if you're interested, you want to chat, you can email or you can do old school using pen and paper.
So